Tonight, we begin inside a medieval castle. Stone corridors stretch ahead of you, torches guttering in their iron brackets, shadows jumping across walls worn smooth by centuries of passing feet. It looks magnificent, in the way that things often look magnificent before you actually have to live in them. The tapestries are impressive. The carved stonework is impressive. The sheer thickness of the walls, some of them 12 feet of solid rock between you and the outside world, is genuinely impressive. None of it will keep you warm. That part is less impressive. Here's the plain reality of sleeping in a medieval castle. The cold was not a minor inconvenience to be managed with an extra blanket. It was the defining fact of every night between October and April. The same stone walls that shrugged off battering rams and siege engines also functioned with remarkable efficiency as a giant refrigerator. Once the sun dropped and the fires began to fade, the interior temperature followed it down with no particular reluctance. You would notice this the moment you stepped inside. Your breath would cloud in front of your face. The air would feel heavy, damp, carrying a chill that seemed to come not from any single direction, but from everywhere at once. From the floor, from the walls, from the ceiling above you. Stone does not simply fail to warm a space. It actively resists it. Medieval architects were brilliant people. They thought carefully about moats, drawbridges, arrow slits, the angles of defensive walls, and the placement of towers for maximum visibility. Insulation did not make the blueprints. Comfort, as a concept, appears to have been considered someone else's problem. And the location made things worse. Many castles across northern Europe were deliberately built on exposed hilltops. Strategically perfect, thermally catastrophic. From a military standpoint, the elevation gave defenders an unobstructed view of approaching enemies and a natural advantage on the slopes. From the standpoint of someone trying to sleep, it meant the wind had an unobstructed view of you. It scoured every surface, forced itself through gaps in shutters and under heavy doors, and treated every architectural imperfection as a personal invitation. Even the fireplaces offered less salvation than you might hope. A fire blazing in the great hall or a bedchamber hearth created a warm circle. A small, loyal radius of tolerable heat that extended perhaps a few feet in every direction and then gave up entirely. Step beyond it, and the cold resumed as though the fire were simply a rumor. There is a detail that appears in written accounts from the later medieval period that stops you for a moment. Travelers and nobles alike recorded frost forming on the inside of castle bedrooms. Not on the windowsills, on the walls, on the bed curtains, on the surface of the wash basin, which would be frozen solid by morning. Chroniclers noted this with the weary matter-of-factness of people describing weather they had long stopped arguing with. If your chamber did not grow a thin skin of rime across the stones in January, you were apparently in the minority. The majority accepted it as one of the standard features of the room, alongside the tapestry and the chamber pot. And yet people survived. Not just survived. They slept, night after night, through winters that would send the modern mind spiraling toward a hotel booking. They did it through ingenuity, through ritual, through an accumulated body of practical knowledge passed down across generations. Every technique they used, every layer of fabric, every heated stone, every dog pressed against cold feet, was a small, deliberate act of resistance against an environment that had absolutely no interest in keeping them comfortable. You are currently lying in a warm bed in a heated room, listening to a story about people who had neither of those things. There is something quietly absurd about that. Enjoy it. As the night settles around this imagined castle, your boots scrape across flagstone floors worn glassy with use. The chill bites at any skin left exposed. The walls rise around you like cliffs of cold. And somewhere ahead, through a heavy wooden door and up a spiral staircase that seems designed specifically to funnel wind, is your bed. The fight for warmth is about to begin. And it will not be a short one. Before you face the bedchamber, there is one more reason to linger. At the far end of the corridor, behind a door thick enough to discourage conversation, the great hall is still alive. You push through and the contrast is immediate. After the dead cold of the passageway, the hall hits you like a different country. Long trestle tables run the length of the room, their surfaces dark with years of use. The air is thick with the smell of roasted meat, spilled ale, damp wool, and the particular kind of smoke that has been clinging to the rafters for so long it has essentially become part of the architecture. Somewhere near the far wall, a fire the approximate size of a small cottage burns with genuine commitment. Dogs weave between the legs of benches, tails working hopefully. A servant crosses the room with a jug held at the angle of someone who has been doing this for hours and would very much like to stop. This is the beating heart of the medieval castle after dark. It is loud, slightly chaotic, and for a few hours each evening, almost warm. The Great Hall's hearth was not modest. These were enormous constructions, fed almost constantly through the winter months with logs of a scale that would give a modern woodpile an identity crisis. Entire tree trunks disappeared into them. And unlike the smaller fires in private chambers, the hall hearth had enough mass and enough fuel to genuinely push heat into the space around it, for a radius at least of maybe 10 or 15 feet. Beyond that, the hall reasserted its true nature as a large stone box, and the cold crept back in along the walls and up from the floor. Rank determined proximity. Those with status claimed seats closest to the fire and basked in the orange heat while their faces went pink and their backs stayed cold. Those without it stood at the edges, wrapped in cloaks, stamping feet quietly, performing the universal expression of people pretending they are fine. Here is an observation buried in the records that is either charming or faintly desperate depending on how you look at it. Nobles in several documented households deliberately scheduled their largest feasts during the coldest months. Not only for the warmth of the fire, but for the warmth of the guests. Hundreds of bodies packed into a stone hall generated meaningful heat. Servants in some accounts were reportedly instructed to stand closer together for this reason. The medieval feast was, among other things, a collective heating strategy dressed up in roasted swan and minstrelsy. It worked, up to a point. The hall could, on a good night with a full fire and a full room, approach something that a charitable person might describe as cozy. And for a few hours, the medieval night felt survivable. People laughed, drank, ate, and absorbed warmth into their bones like creatures storing up reserves for a long migration. Then the feast ended. The minstrels packed away their instruments. The guests drained their cups and began the reluctant process of leaving. The fire, no longer being fed with the urgency of a room full of cold nobles, was allowed to settle into itself. Logs collapsed into embers. Embers faded toward ash. The dogs, previously animated by the possibility of scraps, found corners and curled into them. Within an hour or two, the great hall that had been the warmest place in the castle became simply another cold stone room with a glow in it. The walk from the hall to the sleeping chambers was, by multiple accounts, one of the more psychologically brutal moments of the medieval night. You stepped out of the firelight into a passageway where the draft arrived immediately, without ceremony, as though it had been waiting. Your breath fogged. The warmth you had spent the entire evening accumulating began to drain away with each step up the staircase. Travelers who wrote about their experiences in castles mentioned this transition more than almost anything else. Not the cold of the bed itself, but the shock of that walk. The body, briefly convinced that warmth was the natural state of things, objected strongly to being corrected. Some people refused to make the journey at all. A high-backed bench pulled close to the hearth, a cloak pulled over the shoulders, and a reasonable amount of self-deception could serve as a bed for the night. Servants and guards collapsed near the dying embers rather than face cold chambers above. The risks were real: sparks, smoke, the general indignity of sleeping on a bench. But weighed against the alternative, many considered them acceptable. Peasants, it is worth noting, often lived with a version of this problem solved by default. Their homes, timber and daub, low-ceilinged, small enough to be warmed by a single hearth, held heat the way a cupped hand holds water. And when you finally stepped out, skin flushed, muscles loosened, the body convinced at some deep level that it had been restored to its correct operating temperature, the cold that met you in the air felt, briefly, less like a permanent condition and more like a manageable inconvenience. The warmth did not last, of course. It never did. But the body's memory of it did, and a person who climbed into bed within 20 minutes of a hot bath was in a different relationship with their blankets than one who had arrived cold and stayed cold through the whole process of preparation. The bath was an investment. You paid for it in firewood and labor and the considerable effort of heating enough water. You collected on it in the form of sleep that came faster and felt, in its opening hours at least, more genuine. For those without the resources for a full bath, which was most people on most nights, smaller versions of the same principle served the same purpose at reduced cost. Hot water for the feet in a wooden basin. A heated cloth pressed to the back of the neck. The great lord in his hall required hundreds of guests and a bonfire to approximate what a peasant achieved by simply having a small house. The warm damp of a towel wrung out near the fire and applied to cold hands before bed. Each of these was a miniature version of the bath's logic. Introduce warmth to the body before sleep, rather than requiring the body to generate it from nothing. Spiced wine, hippocras, heated and seasoned with cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and whatever spices the household's budget and the spice merchant's inventory allowed, was the most widely practiced of the pre-sleep indulgences, and the one most consistently documented across different levels of society. It was drunk warm, ideally near the fire, in a cup that transferred its heat to the hands while the contents transferred it to the throat and chest, and from there, with the particular efficiency of warm liquid, to the rest of the body. The physician attached to the court of Charles VI of France recommended hot mead at night as a medical prophylactic against the chill entering the bones, framing the same instinct in the language of humoral theory, where warm, moist drinks balance the body's inner fluids against the cold, dry air of winter nights. Whether the alcohol made you genuinely warmer or simply convinced you that you were genuinely warmer is a debate that has not been settled to everyone's satisfaction. The honest answer involves both effects operating simultaneously, and the distinction between them mattering less than whether the outcome, a person who climbed into bed relaxed and drowsy and not actively miserable with cold, was achieved. It was reliably. The argument about the mechanism continued in the background, as arguments about mechanisms tend to do, while the practice itself persisted without waiting for resolution. Ale was the more democratic version of the same logic. This irony was not lost on contemporaries. Consumed warm in winter, rich in calories, available to most households at most times, it provided the same basic service as hippocras with less ceremony and considerably less expense. A cup of warm ale before bed was not a luxury. It was standard practice across classes, adapted to whatever quality and quantity the household's resources provided. The peasant family's warm ale and the noble's spiced hippocras were cousins serving the same function, dressed differently for the occasion. Heated stones wrapped in cloth were the solid equivalent of the warming drink, warmth introduced to the body through physical contact rather than ingestion. Set at the foot of the bed before the curtains were drawn, a stone heated in the fire and wrapped in thick wool retained its warmth for hours, providing a concentrated source of heat at precisely the location, the feet, where the cold made its most effective early arguments. Some households experimented with leather pouches filled with heated sand, which conformed more readily to the contours of whatever they were pressed against, and held their warmth with slightly more persistence than stone. The principle in both cases was the same. Create a small thermal reservoir in the bed that would still be releasing heat at midnight when the fire had died down, and the body's own resources were working their hardest. The combination of these measures, bath where possible, warm drink when available, heated stone at the foot of the bed, warming pan between the sheets, represented the medieval sleeper's most complete deployment of available resources. Not every household had access to all of them on every night. A few surviving letters mention it, usually with the tone of someone who has just noticed something obvious that perhaps should have been obvious earlier. But the instinct behind them was universal. Do not leave the body to fight the cold alone. Give it allies. Warm it before sleep, from outside and inside both. And the night that followed would be not comfortable. The available architecture made comfort a relative concept, but survivable in a way that accumulated comforts made survivable rather than merely endured. The cup is warm in your hands now. The spices in it release their smell into the air around your face. Cinnamon and something sharper. Clove, perhaps. the imported fragrance of distant places arriving in this cold stone room via a trade route that stretches halfway across the known world. You drink slowly. The warmth moves through you in a way that the fire, for all its spectacle, never quite manages from its position across the room. At the foot of the bed, wrapped in a fold of thick wool, a stone is waiting. You finish the cup, set it down, but for now you are still in the hall. The servant takes it and withdraws. The cold is still there, patient and entirely untroubled by the wine. But you are warmer than you were, which is the only victory the night was ever offering. Close your eyes for a moment and stop thinking about temperature. Think instead about what you are breathing. Because the medieval bedroom arrived through the nose as much as through any other sense, and the account of a night spent in a castle chamber is incomplete without the full olfactory inventory of what the air in that room actually contained. It was not, to anticipate the obvious question, lavender. It was not the crisp linen of a hotel advertisement or the clean neutrality of a well-ventilated modern room. It was a composition, layered, complex, occasionally overwhelming, that reflected every material, every practice, and every compromise that made the medieval night possible. The foundation was smoke. The fire has dropped to a low, honest burn. Always smoke, beneath everything else, as constant as the cold and considerably less easy to romanticize. It had arrived through the chimney and through the fireplace opening, and through the slow diffusion of a building where fires burned somewhere at all times. And it had settled into every surface with the thoroughness of something that understood it was staying permanently. The stone held it. The tapestries held it. The blankets and curtains held it with particular commitment, releasing it in small, concentrated doses every time they were disturbed. You could launder the linen and hang the blankets outside on a dry day and beat the tapestries until your arms gave out. And within a week of winter fires, the smoke would be back, deeper than it had been before, as though the cleaning had merely opened the fibers to receive it more thoroughly. Above the smoke came damp wool. The blankets, the curtains, the nightwear, the cloaks hanging on the peg by the door. All of it was wool, and wool in a stone castle in winter was never entirely dry. Moisture crept through the walls and condensed on surfaces and soaked into fabric with the patient thoroughness of water finding its level. And wool that has absorbed moisture smells of itself more intensely. Earthy, lanolin rich, with a faint sourness at the edges that distinguished it from the smell of dry wool the way a river smells different from rain. The warmth the wool provided was real. The last cup has been drained. The smell it provided was part of the transaction. Underneath your feet, the rushes contributed their own layer. Fresh rushes smelled of the water's edge, reedy, slightly green, carrying the memory of the place they came from. Rushes 3 months into a winter smelled of everything that had happened to them since. The meals that had been eaten above them, the ale that had been spilled into them, the boots that had tracked in whatever the courtyard offered on any given day, the mice that had treated them as a combined restaurant and residential development. The herbs scattered among them at the beginning of the season, the lavender, the rosemary, the meadowsweet, had been crushed to faint ghosts of themselves, contributing a suggestion of fragrance that the underlying reality had long since overwritten. Then there was the human element. Medieval hygiene operated under constraints of water temperature, fuel cost, and available time that produced, as their combined outcome, people who washed less frequently than the modern norm and wore clothing that absorbed the evidence of this across the working day before bringing it to bed. In a shared sleeping space, a dormitory, a family bed, a chamber where servants slept on pallets nearby, this element multiplied. Sweat, breath, the specific warmth of bodies that had been working and eating and existing since before dawn, all of it present in the air of the room at the level of a background note that became foreground when you stopped thinking about the cold long enough to notice what else was there. The counteroffensive against all of this was real, if limited. The warmth that has been your companion for the past several hours is beginning its slow departure, and you feel it going the way you feel a good thing ending. With reluctant awareness and a slight chill that has nothing to do with temperature. Better households burned incense in small braziers, aromatic resins that released sweet, resinous smoke into rooms that were already smoky. A solution with obvious structural irony but genuine olfactory effect. The incense smell was specific and strong enough to overlay the ambient composition for several hours, creating pockets of something that smelled at least intentional. Perfumed oils dabbed onto linens or clothing introduced smaller, more personal notes. Lavender, rose water, whatever the household's resources and preferences ran to, that were overwhelmed in large rooms but made a discernible contribution in the enclosed space behind bed curtains where the air was still and the nose was close to the fabric. The honest assessment was that none of it solved the problem. The incense burned out. The perfume faded. The smoke and the damp wool and the rushes were structural features of the room that no amount of rosemary could permanently displace. Noble households spent money on fragrance with the persistence of people who believed the situation improvable and the effort worth making, and the situation remained, fundamentally, itself. What changed, over years and decades of living in it, was perception. The medieval nose adapted. You have to go upstairs eventually. Not to the point of not noticing. Contemporary accounts complain about the smell of their own environments with sufficient frequency to establish that nobody was unaware of it, but to the point of experiencing it as home rather than assault. The specific composition of smoke and wool and damp stone and old rushes that characterized a particular chamber became associated with safety, familiarity, the particular place where you had slept 1,000 times and expected to sleep 1,000 more. The smell of the room was the smell of the room, and the room was where you belonged. And belonging somewhere in a cold world that offered no guarantees was a comfort that transcended the specific qualities of the air. To breathe smoke and wool was to breathe home. This is not a romanticization. It is an observation about how humans relate to the environments they inhabit over time. And it holds across centuries without requiring those environments to be pleasant by any objective measure. You breathe in now. The smoke is there, as it always is. Beneath it, the wool. The faint ghost of herbs from the rushes, present if you know to look for it. Everyone does. The warm animal smell of the dog at your feet. The cold, clean thread of air that comes through the window gap and runs across everything else like a comment from the outside world. It is not a simple smell. It is not a pleasant smell by modern standards. It is the smell of a specific place at a specific time, composed of every material and every compromise that kept people alive through the night. You have been breathing it for months. By now it smells like winter. By now it smells like you. The warming pan addressed the cold from outside. The spiced wine addressed it from inside. You stand, pull your cloak tighter, and face the door. But before either of those interventions came the meal itself, the last substantial act of the day, the one that determined what resources your body was bringing to the night's long argument with the temperature. In the medieval understanding of how cold worked on the body, food was not merely nutrition. It was fuel in a more immediate sense. Warmth produced through digestion, spreading outward from the stomach in the hours after eating, making the body's defenses against the cold temporarily more robust than they would otherwise be. Whether this understanding was correct in its physiological details matters less than the fact that it directed behavior in ways that turned out to be broadly sensible. A person who went to bed on a full stomach of hot food was warmer in the early hours of the night than a person who went to bed hungry. And the medieval household acted on this observation with the consistency of people who had tested it repeatedly and found it reliable. The pottage was the engine of this system. Thick, slow-cooked, containing whatever the season and the household's resources offered. Barley, dried peas, turnips, onions, parsnips, in noble households supplemented with meat or enriched with cream and spices, in peasant households assembled from whatever had survived the autumn stores. It was eaten hot, usually in the evening, and it sat in the stomach with a heavy, generous warmth that made the cold feel marginally less absolute for several hours after. The heat of the broth warmed the throat on the way down. The bulk of the contents kept the warmth going long after the bowl was empty. You climb the staircase and the cold receives you like an old acquaintance who has never once taken the hint. This was, in the language of humoral medicine, food that heated the body's inner fires. In the language of anyone who has eaten a large bowl of hot soup before going out into winter, it was simply true. A 15th century English manuscript recorded the advice with the confident specificity of someone who had thought carefully about the problem, that leeks eaten at night warmed the belly and chased away the chill of death. The phrase is more dramatic than the vegetable perhaps warrants, but the principle it expressed was not unreasonable. Strong flavored root vegetables were believed to stimulate digestion and generate internal warmth. Whether they did so by the mechanisms the medieval physician imagined is doubtful. Whether eating them hot in the evening helped you feel warmer through the night than not eating them would have is considerably less doubtful. Ale was the universal accompaniment, and in winter was consumed warm. Heated in a poker-singed jug near the fire, poured steaming into wooden cups, distributed across the social spectrum from great hall to peasant cottage, with the democratic accessibility of a drink whose ingredients were grown locally, brewed domestically, and priced within reach of most household budgets. It provided calories. It provided warmth on the way down. The passageway up here is narrower than the hall below, the torchlight thinner, the air carrying that particular quality of damp that stone produces when it has been cold for long enough. It provided, in sufficient quantity, the pleasant loosening of tension that made the prospect of a cold bed feel less like an obstacle and more like a detail. Medieval medicine would have described its benefits in terms of balancing the humors. Modern understanding would describe them in terms of caloric content and mild sedation. Both descriptions account for why people drank it before bed. Hippocras occupied the superior end of the same category. Spiced wine heated and sweetened, its flavoring drawn from the imported spices that arrived in Northern Europe via trade routes reaching back to the east. Cinnamon from Ceylon, ginger from India, cloves from islands whose names were known only to the merchants who traveled there and returned with their cargo. To drink Hippocras was to taste a geography entirely outside the experience of most people who consumed it. The spices carrying the warmth of climates that the damp stone castle could not have imagined. The physician of Charles VI recommended hot mead at night as a specific defense against cold entering the bones. The humoral logic being that warm, moist drinks counteracted the cold, dry quality of winter air and kept the body's inner balance from tipping toward the dangerous chill that bred illness. The practical logic being that a warm drink before bed was a warm drink before bed, and no further explanation was required. The debate about whether alcohol warmed or merely created the impression of warmth has the quality of a debate conducted by people who have continued drinking while having it, which in this case is approximately always. The physiological truth that alcohol dilates blood vessels, creates a sensation of warmth while actually accelerating heat loss through the skin, was not available to medieval drinkers, and the behavioral truth that a cup of warm Hippocras made the walk to the cold bed feel more manageable, was observable to everyone. On the practical question of whether medieval people slept better on warm ale and spiced wine, the answer drawn from contemporary accounts is yes, or at least they reported sleeping better, which in the context of a night that offered no guarantees was close enough to the same thing. Peasant households ate the same meal with less ceremony and equivalent effect. A bowl of hot porridge, oats or barley cooked thick, perhaps sweetened with a scrape of honey if the bees had been generous, eaten near the fire with the family crowded around the single source of light and heat, performed exactly the same function as the noble's pottage and Hippocras, scaled to the available ingredients and the available resources. Children licked spoons clean and were sent to bed warm from the inside out. Parents followed after banking the fire and hoping the morning would be less cold than the evening had suggested. Folk medicine contributed its own recommendations to the pre-sleep diet, some of them still in the family of the plausible and some of them in a different family entirely. Garlic eaten before bed was held to prevent frostbite, the belief being that garlic stimulated circulation in the extremities, keeping the blood moving through fingers and toes that were otherwise in danger of going numb overnight. Whether garlic achieves this is uncertain. That the people sleeping in medieval stone chambers in January had cold feet and were willing to eat anything that might address this is not uncertain at all. You pass walls that in some sections measure 12 feet thick, a fact that sounds on paper like excellent news. The garlic breath in a shared bed was presumably an accepted feature of the arrangement. Everyone else had eaten it too. Hot porridge, warm ale, spiced wine, leeks, garlic. The pre-sleep meal was a final layer of preparation, invisible but present, working through the night from the inside while the blankets and curtains and dog worked from the outside. Together, they constituted a system, imperfect in every component and functional as a whole, aimed at the single goal of keeping a human body warm enough to sleep until morning. The cup in your hands earlier is empty now. The warmth it carried has moved inward, settling somewhere in the chest. A quiet residual heat that the cold room around you has not yet reached. The pottage from earlier is doing its slower work further down, the digestion of it generating a warmth that is less dramatic than the wine, but more sustained. You are not warm. You have not been warm since October in any comprehensive sense of the word. But you are warmer than you would have been without the meal. 12 feet of solid rock between you and the outside world. Than you would have been without the drink. Than you would have been without the fire that heated them, the hands that prepared them, the knowledge accumulated across generations that what you eat before you sleep is part of the armor. The night is long. The stone is cold. The meal was hot. 2 out of 3 is what survival looks like. Everything discussed so far, the layered blankets, the curtained beds, the warming pan, the spiced wine, the dogs pressed against cold feet, assumed a body capable of generating a reasonable baseline of its own heat. A healthy adult, properly equipped and adequately fed, had a fighting chance against a medieval winter night. The fight was not comfortable, but it was winnable. For children and the elderly, the calculation was different. 12 feet of protection from wind, rain, enemies, and the general hostility of the medieval landscape. Their bodies ran colder, recovered more slowly, and offered less margin for error when the temperature dropped below the level that the available defenses could reliably address. The same night that a healthy adult night endured with grumbling and an extra blanket could take a child or an old woman in a way that no amount of subsequent regret would reverse. Medieval households understood this with the clarity of people who had seen it happen, and they arranged their sleeping spaces accordingly. Children were almost never given their own chambers. The instinct that modern domestic architecture expresses as the child's bedroom, a private space decorated to the child's specifications, where the small person retires to their own domain, was not available and would not have seemed sensible if it had been. A child alone in a stone room in January was a child in danger. Children slept in nurseries close to the kitchen's residual warmth, or clustered with servants in the smaller, warmer chambers of the household's lower floors, or simply in the same bed as their parents, where the accumulated warmth of adult bodies surrounding a smaller one provided the most reliable insulation available. Babies received special attention that contemporary accounts describe with a specificity suggesting it was a matter of genuine anxiety rather than routine procedure. Swaddled tightly in layers of linen and wool. The swaddling itself serving both to retain warmth and to restrict movement in the belief that it promoted healthy development. A theory that modern pediatrics has revised substantially, but which had the incidental thermal advantage of being correct about warmth. They were placed in cradles positioned as close to the fire as the risk of sparks permitted. In the most careful arrangements, the cradle stood within the curtained area of the mother's bed, the body heat of the sleeping adult supplementing whatever warmth the room offered. What those 12 feet do not protect you from is the cold they have been quietly storing since November. A 14th century chronicle describes a noble child laid in a wicker crib beside the fire, wrapped in furs, a small canopy rigged above to trap the warmth within. The detail is touching in the way that evidence of parental care across centuries tends to be. It is also evidence of the anxiety that accompanied winter in households with infants. The awareness that the night held genuine risk for the most vulnerable members of the family, and that the measures taken against it needed to be comprehensive. Medieval infant mortality was high for many reasons. Winter cold was one of them. The elderly occupied the other end of the vulnerability spectrum with the same logic in reverse. A body that had spent decades generating heat was not generating it as efficiently as it once had. The reserves were thinner, the response to cold slower, the window between uncomfortable and dangerous narrower than it would be in a younger body. Peasant households addressed this with the directness of people making practical arrangements without the resources for elaborate alternatives. Grandparents slept closest to the fire, their position by the hearth a function of necessity as much as deference, younger and more thermally robust family members accepting the colder spots on the bed without making a production of the sacrifice. Castle households had more options and used them. This is the central paradox of the castle as a place to sleep. Elderly relatives were moved into smaller chambers during the worst months. The same logic that made the solar better than the Great Hall applied to anyone whose survival was in question. Smaller spaces were warmer spaces, and warmth was the variable being managed. In extreme cases, the warmth of the kitchen became the relevant resource. An elderly Burgundian matron documented in a period letter insisted on sleeping in the bakehouse during hard winters, her reasoning being that the oven's residual heat, the warmth stored in its stone after a full day of bread baking, released slowly through the night, provided a quality of sustained ambient warmth that no curtained bed in a stone chamber could replicate. She was not wrong. She was also presumably covered in flour by morning, which the letter does not address. Medical texts of the period prescribed specific additional measures for the old and young with the careful specificity of writers who considered the problem worth detailed attention. Heated stones wrapped in cloth placed at the feet, the same tool used in better appointed adult beds, deployed here with particular urgency. Mulled drinks administered before sleep to fortify the inner warmth. Physicians warned that sudden chills could, as one writer put it, extinguish the flame of life in bodies where that flame burned less strongly. A vivid metaphor that translated directly into practical advice about not letting old people or infants sleep in cold rooms without additional resources. Whether medieval families consistently followed this advice, or whether the reality of limited resources and competing demands meant that the most vulnerable sometimes received less protection than the ideal prescribed, is a question the historical record answers with uncomfortable honesty. The same mass that made it militarily formidable made it thermally insufferable. The measures were known. They were practiced when they could be. Infant mortality and winter deaths among the elderly remained high throughout the period, suggesting that knowing what to do and being able to do it consistently were different problems, and that the second was harder than the first. The tension between care and limitation was real, and it shaped how medieval people thought about age and childhood. Not as categories to be protected from difficulty, but as categories requiring specific accommodations within the difficulty that was universal. Everyone was fighting the cold. The young and the old were fighting it with less equipment and less margin, and the household arranged itself around that fact as best it could. Picture the peasant cottage on a hard January night. The fire banked as high as the remaining fuel allows. The grandmother positioned closest to it, her breathing slow and even in the firelight. A baby swaddled in the bed between its parents, their sleeping bodies forming walls of warmth on either side. Stone absorbs cold the way it absorbs everything, slowly, completely, and with a long memory. The older children heaped together on the straw tick, the tangle of limbs and blankets producing a collective warmth that none could generate alone. The father nearest the door, where the cold is worst because someone has to be there and the choice of who is made without discussion. In the castle above, the same arrangements play out at larger scale and greater expense. A nursemaid sits with the cradle. Hot stones are renewed at midnight by a servant whose job it is to ensure they are still warm when they are needed. An elderly nobleman's bed curtains are drawn by hands other than his own, checked for gaps, tucked at the edges with the thoroughness of someone who understands that the curtains are not decorative. The care is visible in the record, even across the distance of centuries. So is the cold. By this point in the night, you have deployed most of what the medieval household had available. The layers are in place. Step into a basement in winter and you understand it immediately. The curtains are drawn. The warming pan has done its work. The wine has done its work. The dog is doing its work with characteristic commitment and no awareness that it is doing anything in particular. And yet, for a medieval sleeper, this was not quite the complete picture. Because the cold was not only a physical threat to be managed with blankets and fires, it was a medical one. A force that acted on the body's internal balance in ways that the most sophisticated understanding of the age described with careful precision and addressed with remedies that range from the modestly sensible to the genuinely surprising. The framework was the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Four fluids whose relative balance determined health, temperament, and the body's capacity to resist illness. Temperature was central to maintaining that balance. The temperature down there has nothing to do with today's weather. Cold in the humoral system was not merely uncomfortable. It was physiologically active. Too much of it, entering through the skin or breathed in through the air, caused the humors to thicken and congeal, to lose the fluid mobility that kept the body functioning correctly and take on a sluggish, blocked quality that expressed itself as illness. The cold did not simply make you shiver. It made you sick from the inside by altering the fundamental composition of what you were made of. This framework produced medical advice about sleep that took the cold seriously as a clinical problem requiring clinical solutions. Physicians of the 13th and 14th centuries wrote about bedtime preparation with the specificity of people addressing a documented risk. One manual recommended rubbing the feet with warm oil before lying down. Not for comfort, though comfort was not discouraged, but to open the pores of the skin, which were believed to contract in cold and trap harmful humors inside the body, rather than allowing them to be expelled. The oil was warming in quality, its heat penetrating the skin and reversing the contraction, restoring the body's ability to breathe and regulate itself correctly. Whether any of this reflected accurate physiology is a question with a known answer. It reflects the accumulated chill of weeks, stored in the walls and floor and ceiling, radiating outward with patient indifference to your comfort. Whether rubbing warm oil onto cold feet before bed made the person who did it more comfortable and more likely to sleep well is a different question with a different answer. Heated milk with honey was prescribed for similar reasons. Warm, moist, sweet. Qualities that the humoral system categorized as corrective against cold, dry, bitter winter air. The recommendation read like medical instruction and functioned like common sense, which is the most flattering possible account of what happens when a theoretical framework produces advice that happens to be reasonable for reasons unrelated to the theory. A French surgeon of the period warned his readers that sleeping in damp chambers could breed melancholy, specifically by chilling the black bile, which when cold produced the heavy, dark, ruminative state that the humoral system identified as the melancholic temperament. His prescription was tapestries. Not for warmth primarily, though warmth was the practical mechanism, but because damp cold acting on the black bile produced a clinical outcome that his patients presumably wished to avoid. This may be the only moment in the history of interior decoration where hanging a tapestry was formally classified as psychiatric treatment. Folk medicine ran alongside the formal medical tradition with less theoretical apparatus and occasionally more creative solutions. Garlic or onion rubbed on the soles of the feet before sleep was held to prevent cold from entering the body through the extremities. The pungent compounds in the plants were thought to generate heat that penetrated upward through the legs and maintained circulation through the night. The mechanism was wrong. Castle walls did the same thing, but at scale. The outcome, feet that had been thoroughly rubbed and thus somewhat stimulated before sleep, was not entirely without effect. The smell in a shared bed was a separate question that folk medicine declined to address. Wool soaked in wine and tied around the wrists appeared in several household remedy collections. The wine warming, the wool insulating, the combination addressing the wrist pulse points that humoral theory identified as sites where the body's vital heat was particularly accessible. Whether this worked by any mechanism other than the warmth of wet wool against skin is doubtful. Whether it was worth trying on a night when your wrists were cold is a question that answers itself. The live rooster is where the record pauses to acknowledge that not every folk remedy operated within even the loosest interpretation of plausible mechanism. An English herbal of the period recommended keeping a rooster in the bedroom to draw the frost away from the sleeping man. The bird's body heat and its connection to the dawn presumably offering some protection against the cold that purely inanimate objects could not provide. Whether anyone actually slept with a rooster in their chamber is a question the herbal does not answer. Whether such an arrangement would have improved the temperature of the room is one that physics can address more confidently. The rooster was warm. Even on the relatively mild days that occasionally interrupted a medieval winter, the interior stone held its cold like a conviction. The room was large. The contribution was theoretical. What unites all of these practices, the warm oil, the medicated drinks, the garlic, the wine-soaked wool, the improbable rooster, is the refusal to accept the cold as a condition to be endured passively. The humoral framework, whatever its limitations as a description of actual physiology, gave people a language for understanding what the cold did to them and a set of actions for responding to it. The actions ranged in effectiveness from genuinely useful to entirely symbolic. In both cases, they represented the same fundamental orientation. The night is dangerous, the body is vulnerable, and the appropriate response is not resignation but preparation. The irony noted by historians of medieval medicine, that many of the remedies created their own problems, that smoke-filled rooms treating the cold produced lung disease, that heavy blankets causing immobility contributed to joint pain, that oily ointments collected the dirt of a stone room and introduced it to the skin, was probably not invisible to contemporaries. People lived with the consequences of their treatments and observed the results. But the alternative to the treatment was the untreated cold, which had consequences too, and they were worse. You lie still now, letting the wine and the oil and whatever else the evening's preparations included work their way through you at the pace that warm things move through a body already halfway toward sleep. The outside air might soften briefly. The humoral theory is not one you hold, but the warmth is real regardless of the framework used to explain it. Outside the curtains, the room is cold. Inside your body, something is working to keep it that way. The oil has been rubbed in. The wine has been drunk. The stone is at your feet, and the dog is against your legs, and the curtains are drawn, and the coif is tied, and every physical preparation that the household's resources and the evening's time allowed has been completed. You have addressed the cold with everything material that was available to you. And now, before the candle goes out, there is one more layer to add. The one that has no weight, takes up no space, costs nothing beyond the breath required to speak it, and was considered by the people who used it to be as necessary as any of the others. You reach for the small pouch hanging from the bedpost. The walls did not care. It contains rue and mugwort and a sprig of juniper dried from last summer's cutting, tied together in cloth and placed where the sleeper's breath would pass it in the night. The smell is sharp and clean and slightly medicinal. The scent of plants that were believed to drive away not only bad air, but the things that traveled in bad air. The invisible agents of illness and the less invisible agents of harm that the medieval understanding of the night included without apology. The night was not safe. Everyone agreed on this. The disagreement was only about the precise nature of the threats it contained. Cold and illness were the physical ones. But medieval people navigated the dark hours with a cosmology that included presences less easily addressed by blankets. Spirits, demons, the night hag who was blamed for the suffocating pressure on the chest that we now understand as sleep paralysis, and that contemporary accounts described as a malevolent visitor sitting on the sleeper in the dark. Against these, the herbs in the pouch and the cross above the bed and the prayer said before lying down were not superstition in the dismissive modern sense of that word. They were the appropriate tools for the appropriate category of threat, applied with the same practical seriousness as the warming pan. Prayers came first. They had made up their minds in October and would not be revisiting the decision until April at the earliest. The monastic tradition prescribed specific psalms before sleep. And while not every layperson followed a monastic schedule, the habit of spoken prayer at bedtime crossed every boundary of wealth and education. Paternosters and Ave Marias were said by noble families at carved wooden prie-dieu and by peasant families in the dark of their cottages with the same words and the same intent. To place the night and its contents under the protection of something that could not be outrun by drafts or extinguished by cold. The prayer was armor of a different kind, fitted to a different category of threat, and worn with the same matter-of-fact necessity as the coif. Iron objects occupied a specific role in the protective inventory. A knife placed beneath the pillow or under the bed, its blade visible in the dim light, catching what little glow the dying candle offered, was not there for physical defense, though it served that purpose too if needed. Iron was believed to repel the fairy folk and the demons that moved through the night hours, the beings that humoral medicine did not account for, and that required older tools than warm oil to address. The iron's presence was a statement of occupancy. This space is claimed. This sleeper is protected. Whatever you are not welcome here. Whether the claim was honored by its intended audience is outside the scope of what the historical record can verify. That people made it consistently, across centuries and across the full social range, suggests it was not considered an optional precaution. The folk practices extended into the specific geography of the cold. Near the hearth in any given chamber, a determined fire could carve out a bubble of tolerable warmth, perhaps 10 feet across if the logs were good and the chimney cooperated. Turning your shoes upside down beside the bed was held to keep frost from biting your toes through the night. The logic being that something about the orientation of the shoe interrupted whatever path the cold used to find its way to the extremities. The mechanism was not specified. The practice was. Whispering the names of 3 saints before extinguishing the candle was held to prevent the body's heat from leaving during sleep. A belief that understood body warmth as something that could be stolen in the night if the appropriate precautions were not taken to secure it. 3 saints' names, spoken quietly into the chamber as the last light went out, were the lock on that particular door. The children whose parents pressed garlic under their pillows against both sickness and spirits received in a single gesture protection from 2 categories of threat that medieval medicine and medieval cosmology agreed to treat as related. Illness entered through the same doors as evil. The defenses against one were appropriate against the other. Garlic kept away vampires in the folklore of certain regions and infections in the folklore of physicians. And if the mechanism differed between the 2 applications, the practical habit was the same and could be maintained without resolving the theoretical question. Animals were included in the protective rituals with the consistency of households where the line between the practical and the spiritual was not sharply drawn. Written accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries describe noble families huddled directly in front of the flames, cloaks pulled over their heads like makeshift hoods, faces flushed while their backs remained in a different season entirely. Cows and sheep in the byre were sometimes blessed before nightfall, a brief prayer or sign over the animals that were providing body heat to the building around them, an acknowledgement that their welfare and the household safety were connected in ways that deserved formal recognition. The blessing served the animals, the household, and the relationship between them. And in a world where the loss of livestock in winter could mean the loss of the family's livelihood, the gesture was not merely pious. Historians reading the accounts of these practices tend to sort them into categories: genuine belief versus habit, effective versus symbolic, rational versus superstitious. And the sorting tends to reflect the framework of the historian as much as the framework of the medieval practitioner. The people who turned their shoes upside down and said 3 saints' names and hung juniper above the bed were operating within a complete and internally consistent understanding of what the night contained and what it required. The cold was one threat. The spirits were another. The illness that traveled in cold air was connected to both. You addressed all of them with the tools appropriate to each, and you did not experience your preparations as divided between the rational and the irrational, because that division was not part of your understanding of the night. The result, practically, was a bedtime ritual of considerable length and layered purpose. Physical preparations and spiritual ones interleaved with the same seriousness: the oil and the prayer, the coif and the charm, the warming pan and the upside-down shoes. To a modern observer, it looks like 2 different activities occupying the same time slot. Servants standing behind them stamp their feet with the quiet persistence of people who have accepted their situation but have not made peace with it. To the medieval sleeper, it was one activity: preparing for the night. The candle is almost down to its holder now. The room has contracted to the small circle of its remaining light. You have said what needs to be said. The herbs are where they should be. The iron is under the pillow and the shoes are upside down, and the 3 names have been spoken quietly into the dark. You reach for the candle. Pause. The cold, the spirits, the frost on the walls, the long hours between now and dawn. All of it is still there, patient and entirely untroubled by the preparations you have made. But you have made them anyway. Step 10 feet from that fire and you are in an icebox. That is what the night requires. You blow out the flame, the candle is out. The room is dark in the complete, non-negotiable way that a room without electric light and with shuttered windows is dark. Not the soft urban darkness that modern eyes are accustomed to, where some residual glow always arrives from somewhere, but the kind of dark that presses against open eyes with a physical quality, indistinguishable from closed ones. The only light is the faint ember glow from the hearth, a deep red thread at the edge of vision, insufficient for anything but its own comfort. In this darkness, the cold continues its work. It has been working all evening, of course, through the feast and the fire, through the preparations and the prayers, through every layer of wool and curtain and waxed cloth that has been arranged against it. It has been patient in the way that physical forces are patient, which is to say completely and without effort, because patience is not something it requires. It simply is. And in the dark hours of deep winter, in a stone chamber that has been cold since November and will be cold until March, it begins to make its presence visible. The stone offered no compromise. On the walls, frost bloomed. Not on the outside of the walls, where it belonged, and where anyone would have expected it. On the inside. On the interior surface of the stone that separated the room from the cold, the condensation produced by warm breath meeting cold rock froze into crystals that spread outward from cracks and seams in delicate geometric patterns. A decorative effect that the castle had not been designed to produce, and that its inhabitants would have happily done without. A noble woman writing to a correspondent described waking to find that her bed canopy had, overnight, developed a surface that glittered in the morning light as though it had been sewn with silver. Her breath, captured by the curtains and cooled against the air above the bed, had crystallized on the fabric. It was, she noted, very beautiful and entirely unwelcome, which is a precise description of the aesthetic experience of frost in a place where frost should not be. The letter does not record how long it took the glitter to melt into damp fabric once the fire was rekindled, but damp fabric in a cold stone room is its own problem, so the morning presumably continued in the same spirit. Archaeological surveys of preserved medieval castle structures have found physical evidence of this phenomenon in the form of salt streaks and moisture stains on interior wall surfaces. The residue of repeated cycles of condensation and freezing leaving their chemistry in the stone. The walls remember it even when the accounts do not mention it directly. And then there was the moisture. Servants scraped the frost from interior surfaces in the mornings with the resigned regularity of people performing a task that will need to be repeated tomorrow and the day after and every day until April decides to cooperate. In Scandinavia, where winters achieved a depth of cold that made the northern European average seem moderate, accounts describe icicles forming on the rafters of indoor halls, not in abandoned buildings, not in ruins, but in occupied, inhabited, heated spaces where the fire burned and people slept, and the cold formed ice overhead anyway and dripped onto the beds below when the temperature briefly rose. Cloths were hung below the worst formations to catch the meltwater. The arrangement had the quality of a solution that fully acknowledged it was not solving the problem, but declining to be defeated by it on that particular night. Wash basins frozen solid by morning were documented with the offhand brevity of people reporting something too ordinary to require elaboration. You reached for water and found ice. You chipped the ice and waited for it to melt near the fire. Or you used a different basin, or you accepted that washing was not going to happen until the day had warmed sufficiently to address the question. The freezing of wash water was not an emergency. It was a feature of the season, noted in the same tone that a modern person might note that it is raining, which is to say with resignation and no expectation that the note will change anything. The debate about how geographically widespread this phenomenon was, whether it was specific to the harsh winters of Scandinavia and northern France, or present across a broader range of European climates in poorly heated chambers, is partly a debate about what constitutes a meaningful distinction. Cold walls and warm breath produced condensation as reliably as any physics experiment. Frost on interior walls required specific conditions: sufficient cold, sufficient moisture in the air, stone that had been cold long enough to freeze condensation on contact. These conditions were met in hard winters across a wide range of latitudes, not only in the far north. The accounts come from various locations and treat the phenomenon as familiar rather than remarkable, which suggests it was familiar rather than remarkable in those locations. Frostbite, chilblains, and respiratory illness followed from these conditions with the predictability of outcomes that the conditions reliably produced. Chilblains, The painful, itchy swelling of extremities that results from repeated exposure to cold without reaching the tissue damage of frostbite were so common that medical texts addressed them as routine, prescribing various oils and ointments for their management with the matter-of-fact tone of writers discussing a universal experience. They were. Everyone who lived in a cold stone building through a hard winter had them. They were the minor wound of the season, the cold's ordinary tax on the people who inhabited its territory. The psychological weight of waking to frosted walls and frozen water and the knowledge that the room was colder than when you fell asleep accumulated through the winter months in ways that the practical discomforts alone do not fully account for. Diaries and letters from the period describe a specific reluctance about the morning. Not the ordinary reluctance to leave a warm bed, which is universal and eternal, but a more particular dread of the air beyond the curtains, of the room that would be waiting on the other side of that barrier, of the moment when the cold would have to be faced again without the preparation that the evening had allowed. Water gathered on interior surfaces and ran in thin streaks down the stonework, collecting in the gaps between blocks, pooling in corners, soaking into anything left against the wall. Some writers describe the feeling as imprisonment. You could not leave the bed without entering the cold. You could not stay in the bed forever. The day required you to move into a room that was, by any reasonable measure, hostile to your presence in it. You did it because it had to be done, because the alternative to doing it was not doing it, which was its own kind of problem. And then you began the preparations for the following night, which would be the same. The frost on the walls caught the first light of morning when the shutters were opened. Briefly beautiful, briefly there, and then gone as the day's air moved through the room and the crystals retreated back into moisture, and the stone resumed its usual appearance of cold, dark indifference. The castle had made its point through the night. The inhabitants had survived it, which was the point they were making in return. Everything so far has assumed a fixed address. Chambers grew damp in a way that went beyond mere inconvenience. A castle with its known cold spots and its seasonal migrations and its familiar arrangement of dogs and curtains and warming pans, operated by a household that had spent years developing the specific adaptations that its specific building required. You knew which chamber was coldest. You knew which fire drew well and which one sent smoke back into the room when the wind came from the east. You knew the dog's preferred sleeping position and the servant who would reliably get up at midnight to tend the fire without being asked. Now take all of that away. The medieval traveler, pilgrim, merchant, soldier, minor noble on the circuit of obligations that medieval social life generated continuously, faced the cold every night without any of it. No familiar chamber, no established routine, no household apparatus accumulated over years of practical problem solving. Just the night, the cold, and whatever the road had produced by way of shelter before the light failed. The inn was the standard answer, and the standard answer was complicated. A medieval inn was, at its best, a timber building with a smoky main hall, a fire that served everyone equally poorly, rooms upstairs where strangers slept in proximity determined by availability rather than preference, and bedding whose previous occupants had left various contributions to its character. The wet cold that resulted was considerably more unpleasant than dry cold. It found its way through clothing with less resistance and stayed longer once it arrived. At its worst, it was a single room with a floor and a roof and a fire and whatever else the landlord had been able to justify as hospitality. In both cases, it provided the essential thing, other people. This is what the inn reliably offered and what the cold night reliably required. You arrived cold, wet, hungry, and alone in the specific way that traveling makes you alone, separated from everyone who knows your name and is invested in your survival. The inn gave you a fire and a room full of other travelers who were cold and wet and hungry in the same ways, and the collective body heat of that room was, by the morning, what had kept everyone's toes attached. A 15th century Italian traveler, writing home with the candid misery of someone who had not expected England to be this cold, noted that the beds were alive with inhabitants he had not been introduced to, a delicate formulation for fleas, but conceded that the company of fellow guests had prevented him from freezing, which was the relevant measure of the night's success. He had survived. The fleas had also survived, but their survival was their own concern. The stables offered a more extreme version of the same principle. Horses, cattle, sheep, large mammals in a confined space generate a quantity of heat that architectural ambition cannot replicate, and that no number of curtains and warming pans can match by volume. In the more extreme cases, moss grew on interior walls. Pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago wrote of choosing the stable over the guest room with the pragmatic satisfaction of people who had done the calculation and found the hay bale more persuasive than the mattress. The smell of the stable was considerable. The warmth was not in question. When the temperature outside dropped below the level that a drafty upstairs room could address, the animals in the stall below became the most effective thermal resource the building contained, and some travelers accessed it directly. This was not universal and not universally dignified, but it was practiced by people who had weighed the options and concluded that dignity was a fair weather consideration. Curled against a horse in January was warmer than shivering on a straw pallet in a room designed for storage that the inn was classifying as accommodation. The horse did not judge. The cold did. Village hospitality provided a third option for travelers carrying the right tokens. A pilgrim's badge, a letter of introduction, the particular air of someone not obviously dangerous who had run out of road before running out of daylight. The tradition of opening a household to travelers in need was embedded in religious obligation and social expectation both, and a family who took in a traveler was performing an act of recognizable merit, while also, incidentally, adding another body to the room's collective warmth. Not in neglected ruins, but in occupied, functioning castle chambers. The traveler received a spot by the fire and a place on the straw mattress. The family received the satisfaction of hospitality fulfilled and one more human radiator for the night. In larger towns, some inns had developed communal sleeping arrangements that removed even the pretense of individual accommodation. A 14th century French town's inn, described in a contemporary account, provided a long wooden platform covered in straw where travelers lay side by side with the democratic closeness of people who had agreed, implicitly, that warmth mattered more than personal space. Men and women, strangers to each other, arranged themselves in rows and slept in the collective warmth of numbers, the arrangement unremarkable to participants who had made the same calculation in the same way on previous journeys and expected to make it again on the next one. The debate about whether this represented worse or better sleeping conditions than a private noble chamber is not really a debate about comfort in any absolute sense. It is a debate about which specific discomforts are more tolerable: the cold isolation of the grand room or the warm crowding of the inn. The people who had experienced both tended, based on the accounts, to have nuanced opinions that varied by the severity of the winter and the quality of the company. A terrible night at a bad inn in a hard frost was a terrible night. A night in a crowded inn with a good fire and reasonable companions was, by several accounts, surprisingly adequate. This is the kind of detail that reframes the romantic image of medieval castle life with some efficiency. Even noble travelers discovered this. The royal progress, the court moving from one great house to another through the landscape, consuming hospitality on a scale that made the host's preparations a significant logistical event, filled available sleeping spaces beyond their designed capacity. Kings and queens were housed in the best rooms available, but their retinues occupied everything else, including arrangements that would not have been proposed under ordinary circumstances. Records of royal progresses contain, if you look for them, the dry administrative language of people who have solved a housing problem but are not entirely happy about how they solved it. The road stripped away the accumulated apparatus of the castle, the familiar dogs, the trained servants, the chambers moved seasonally, the beds traveled with for exactly this purpose, and revealed what was underneath: the need for warmth and the various ways that human beings, pressed together in cold buildings by the simple fact of being in the same place at the same time, generated it for each other without ceremony or particular intention. You think about this now. The inn-room imagined, the straw pallet, the stranger's elbow arriving without announcement from the left, the fire visible through the gap in the curtain, the horse somewhere below radiating warmth through the floor. It is not comfortable. It is not home. But it is, by the measure that the night applies to everything, sufficient. Morning is coming. You are not merely living in a cold house. You are still warm enough to meet it. Not everyone made it to morning. This is the part of the story that the comfortable framing of survival strategies and ingenious adaptations tends to soften at the edges, and it should not be softened. The medieval night was genuinely dangerous in ways that all the blankets and dogs and warming pans in the world could not entirely prevent. And the culture that lived inside those stone walls knew it with a directness that expressed itself in the stories it told and the warnings it passed between generations. The guards in Flanders are perhaps the most arresting image. A winter siege documented in a 13th century chronicle in which soldiers posted on the castle walls were found at dawn exactly as they had been at dusk, upright, positioned, weapons in hand, except that they were dead. The cold had taken them in the night without the drama of a battle, without the announcement of illness, simply by being cold enough for long enough in a place where the fire had gone out, and there was nothing between the men and the temperature except the clothes they stood in. The chronicler recorded it with the tone of someone noting a weather event. Winter had deployed its weapons. The weapons had worked. You were, in meaningful respects, living in a cave that had been given curtains and a coat of arms. The Burgundian noblewoman's Italian cousin provides a different register. Not tragedy, but social comedy with a cold undertone. He had come north expecting the usual variations of European winter, and encountered instead the specific quality of a northern castle's cold, which was in a different category from anything the Italian climate had prepared him for. He trembled all night by her account, and begged audibly for dawn in a way that the household found amusing and retold with the particular relish reserved for stories about people whose discomfort validates your own endurance. He survived. The story about his survival became, in the telling, a story about weakness, about the failure to be adequately prepared for the cold by birth and experience. That the cold that exposed his unpreparedness was genuinely extreme did not enter the framing. A Scandinavian folktale described a bride entering her new husband's castle on a winter night and collapsing from the shock of the cold in the chamber prepared for her. Villagers attributed the collapse to a curse. The ice spirits of the north, offended by some breach of protocol in the wedding arrangements and expressing their displeasure through the most readily available instrument, which was the temperature of the stone room. Whether the woman died or recovered, whether the story had a historical origin or was assembled from the recurring experience of cold chambers and vulnerable bodies, the tale persisted and was told to people preparing for cold nights as a reminder that preparation was not optional. The pilgrims are perhaps the saddest entries in the record. The psychological weight of all this was documented with unusual frankness by people who lived it. Mountain passes in winter took travelers who had underestimated the conditions or been caught by weather that changed faster than their ability to respond to it. Their bodies were found in spring, when the snow retreated enough to reveal them, still curled in the positions of sleep, which is how the cold takes people when it is cold enough and they are tired enough, first as a warmth, then as a weight, then as nothing. Companions wrote about these losses with the grief appropriate to them and also with the practical notation of people adding to the collective knowledge about what the road required. Do not travel this pass after this date. Do not camp without enough fuel. Do not stop moving once you are cold, because the cold will stop you permanently if you give it the opportunity. Soldiers on campaign contributed the military version of the same knowledge. Bedrolls stiff with frost in the morning contained, occasionally, men who would not be using them again. The accounts record this with the brevity of people for whom death was a familiar presence and hypothermia one of its less dramatic forms. You noted it. Cold, in their accounts, occupied a different category from other hardships. You learned from it. You added another blanket to your own roll and hoped that the addition was enough. The stories of endurance ran alongside the stories of loss and were told with equal purpose. Peasants who had survived every winter that the climate had produced without suffering any permanent losses took a quiet pride in this that expressed itself in their framing of the cold. Not as something to be defeated, because the cold could not be defeated, but as something to be outlasted, which was a different relationship and a more honest one. The winter would end. The question was whether you would still be there when it did, and the pride was in the answer being yes. Nobles framed survival differently, as proof of civilizational competence. The feast held in midwinter, the hunt conducted in the frost, the court functioning at full capacity despite the season, all of it a demonstration that wealth and organization had addressed the cold adequately. The demonstration was partly accurate and partly performance. The cold still got through the tapestries and under the fur coverlets and into the chambers moved to the south wall. But the performance of not minding it was itself a form of survival. A refusal to allow the cold to reorganize the social calendar around its requirements. Hunger passed when food arrived. Both framings, the peasants' quiet pride in outlasting and the nobles' defiant performance of normalcy, served the same function. They made the cold something other than simply overwhelming. They placed it in a relationship with the people who endured it that allowed those people to believe they had some agency in the outcome, which was not entirely true and was entirely necessary. The legends accumulated because the cold was real and the stakes were real, and the people who lived with both needed language for the nights when the balance tipped the wrong way. Not to dwell there, not to be paralyzed by the knowledge of what the cold could do, but to remember it, pass it forward, make sure the next generation understood that the preparations were not ceremonial. You think of the guards upright in the frost, the Italian cousin trembling toward dawn, the pilgrims curled in the mountain passes, waiting for a spring they would not see. Illness, in the survivors' accounts at least, eventually resolved. You pull the blanket tighter. It is a small gesture against a large cold. It is also the only gesture available, and the people who made it consistently are the ones who got to tell the story. You have been assuming sleep. But sleep, in the medieval night, was not the uninterrupted 8-hour block that modern understanding has established as the norm, and modern anxiety has made difficult to achieve. It came in pieces, punctuated by waking that was not accidental or pathological, but expected, built into the rhythm of the night as a feature rather than a failure. Historians who have examined the documentary record of medieval sleep with sufficient patience to find the references that were considered too ordinary to emphasize have assembled a picture of what some now call segmented sleep. A pattern of 2 distinct sleep periods separated by an interval of wakefulness lasting an hour or more, occurring naturally around the middle of the night. The first sleep came after dark, carrying the day's exhaustion down into rest with the efficiency of bodies that had worked physically since before dawn. The waking came somewhere around midnight, an interval of quiet consciousness in the deep hours. The second sleep followed, carrying through until dawn. But the cold of a castle in winter was structural, architectural, inescapable. The interval between the 2 sleeps was the property of whoever needed it for whatever the night required. A 15th century physician recommended it for reflection, prayer, gentle conversation, or the kind of intimate exchange that the presence of servants and the obligations of the day made difficult. His description has the quality of a man making the best of an arrangement that the cold and the fire had created rather than anyone having chosen. Because the interval was also, and perhaps primarily, when the fire needed attention. A hearth left entirely unattended from dusk to dawn in the depths of winter was a hearth that would be cold by the second sleep, and a room that would be substantially colder than it needed to be for the remaining hours. Maintaining the fire through the night meant getting up. It meant leaving the warmth of the bed, crossing the cold floor on cold feet, finding the log pile in the near dark, feeding wood into an ember bed that needed to be coaxed back to life before it accepted the new fuel, breathing in the close cold air of the room that had been accumulating outside your curtains since you drew them. The servant whose job this was undertook it with the pragmatic acceptance of someone for whom it was simply what the night required. They rose, wrapped themselves in whatever was reachable, crossed the floor, managed the fire, and returned to their pallet. In households large enough to have fire wardens, servants specifically assigned to nighttime fire maintenance as their primary function, the arrangement was formalized. It was built into the walls. In smaller households, it was shared, each adult taking a turn through the week's rotation with the unspoken understanding that no one wanted to do it and everyone had to. Monasteries handled it through the divine office. The bells that rang through the night calling monks to the canonical hours, matins, lauds, were religious obligations that incidentally ensured a supply of conscious, mobile people at regular intervals through the dark hours. Someone awake for matins could check the fire. Someone rising for lauds could add a log. The spiritual schedule and the thermal one ran in parallel without either acknowledging the other, which is a very efficient arrangement if you are trying to serve 2 masters simultaneously. Rural families developed their own version of the same system. Watch duties were distributed among adults in the household with the informal organization of people who understood that the system worked only if everyone participated, and that the cost of not participating was a cold fire and a cold family, and a morning that started with the long, reluctant process of rekindling from nothing. Peasant children learned early that the middle of the night sometimes required you to get up and add wood to the fire, that this was a contribution to the household's survival rather than an interruption of your own, and that the cold you encountered on the way to the hearth was the reason the system existed. Imagine the moment now. It was the walls. The first sleep has done its work. The room is dark and still, the fire reduced to a low pulse of orange at the base of the hearth. Somewhere in the chamber, someone becomes aware of the cold in a way that sleep had been suppressing. A chill at the edge of the blanket, a stiffness in the feet, the temperature in the enclosed bed dropping below the level that your body's heat can maintain without assistance. You surface. You lie still for a moment, aware of the silence, of the depth of the night, of the fire that is making decisions about whether to continue without your input. You push back the covers. The cold arrives immediately, with the enthusiasm of something that has been waiting outside the curtain since you drew it closed. You are briefly, comprehensively, and inescapably cold in the way that only leaving a warm bed at midnight in a stone castle can produce. Your feet find the rushes. Your hand finds the log. People wrote about dreading it in a way they did not write about much else. Not with the sharp urgency of pain, but with the grinding resignation of something that could not be argued with or solved, only endured night after night until the season finally relented. The ember bed is still alive under its gray surface, still willing to receive what you bring it. You lay the wood carefully. You lean down and blow. A spark, a catch. The flame rises. You stay for a moment, warming your hands, watching the fire confirm its own revival. Then you go back. The bed is still warm from where you were, the warmth preserved by the curtains and the blankets, and the simple fact that a warm thing retains its warmth longer than a cold thing loses it. You pull the covers back up. What this produced, over generations, was a very particular kind of resourcefulness. The fire crackles quietly behind the curtain. The night resumes. The second sleep is coming. It always comes, once the fire is right and the cold has been pushed back to its appropriate distance, and the body has been reminded that it is, for now, adequately equipped for what remains of the dark. You close your eyes. The castle settles around you with the quiet sounds of a building doing what stone buildings do in the cold. Contracting, creaking, making the small structural complaints of something that is very old and very cold and perfectly accustomed to both. The fire speaks in the low, contented language of a fire that has been fed. The second sleep receives you without ceremony, which is the correct way to receive something that has been earned. The fire has been tended. The second sleep has come and gone, and the night is in its final hours. The darkness outside the shutters beginning its slow, barely perceptible retreat toward the gray that precedes dawn. People who slept in these spaces were not passive victims of their architecture. The castle around you is as quiet as it ever gets. The guards changed, the servants not yet risen, the dogs still, the kitchen not yet begun. In this stillness, the hearth speaks in the only voice left in the room. A low, steady crackling. The occasional shift of a log finding a new position in the ember bed. The faint hiss of resin releasing from the wood as the heat reaches it. The fire is not the roaring declaration it was at the height of the evening. It is something quieter and in some ways more honest. A fire that has been working all night, that has passed its peak and settled into the sustained, modest burn of something that has understood its purpose and is fulfilling it without performance. Watch it for a moment. The flames cast moving light across the chamber walls, the shadows they produce shifting with each fluctuation of the burn, contracting when the fire dips, spreading when it rises, creating the impression of a room that breathes. This is what the written accounts are trying to capture when they describe castle fires as alive, when they personify the hearth as the heart of the household, when they reach for metaphors that place the fire in a different category from other household equipment. They learned it, mapped its cold spots and its marginally less cold spots, and made decisions accordingly. They are recording something true about the experience of a single warm light in a cold, dark space. That it reads, to the human nervous system, as presence, as company, as evidence that something in the room is on your side. The paradox of the castle fire was real and consistent. It was simultaneously the most important thing in the building and the least adequate for the scale of what it was asked to do. It burned through resources that entire forests provided at rates that alarmed even the households that could afford them. A French nobleman's complaint that maintaining his great hall fire had emptied the surrounding woodland faster than warfare captures the absurdity with precision. An enterprise that consumed the landscape and heated a radius of perhaps 15 feet. The rest of the vast chamber remaining cold regardless of the commitment demonstrated at the hearth. Some households employed dedicated fire wardens, servants whose sole assigned function was ensuring the hearth never went entirely cold. The position was unglamorous and necessary in equal measure, a job description that consisted entirely of not letting one specific thing happen. To let the hearth die completely was failure in a form that the household registered immediately and physically. They hung tapestries, great woven panels of wool or silk, sometimes 10 or 20 feet across, against the walls, not primarily for beauty, but for the thin layer of resistance they offered against drafts. The fire going out was not a minor inconvenience. It was the loss of the building's center of gravity, the extinguishing of the one point around which warmth organized itself, however inadequately, for everyone within the walls. To let it go cold was disgrace, not only in the social sense. A household that could not maintain its fire was a household that had failed at the most basic level of winter management. But in the more immediate sense of a building that would take hours to warm again, and hours during which the cold had won in a way that was visible and felt by everyone who woke to it. Noble households used the fire as statement as much as resource. The blazing hearth demonstrated the capacity to command fuel in quantities that required woodland, labor, and organization to produce. The fire that never went cold demonstrated the household's control over its own environment. That the control was largely theatrical. That the cold remained outside the fire's immediate reach regardless of how large the flames were or how much of the forest had been fed into them, did not diminish the significance of the statement. You made the statement with what you had. The cold made its counter-statement with what it had. Whether the tapestries made a genuine physical difference or mainly a psychological one is a question historians have not finished arguing about. Both parties understood the terms. Peasants related to their fires differently and in some respects more honestly. The central hearth of a cottage was not a demonstration. It was a fact. The undisguised reason the building was habitable, the thing around which the family's life organized itself in winter without the mediation of status or display. People sat close to it because it was warm, and warmth was what they needed. They told stories by it because the light made it possible and the warmth made it pleasant. They assigned watch over it because the fire was the reason the night was survivable and the watch was the price of that survival. A German traveler wrote of villagers circling their hearth before bed, hands extended toward the flames, whispering what he described as blessings, words directed at the fire itself or through it, at whatever principle the fire represented. He was uncertain whether to call it prayer or superstition, which suggests he understood it was something that did not fit cleanly into either category. The fire received warmth from the wood and returned it to the people. The fact that people invested significant wealth in them suggests the inhabitants believed they helped, which in a cold stone chamber at midnight amounts to almost the same thing. The exchange was so fundamental, so continuous, so woven into the basic conditions of winter survival, that it had acquired a quality of relationship. You thanked the fire the way you thanked a person who had done you a service, not because the fire was a person, but because the gratitude was real and had to go somewhere. Historians who have examined the spiritual dimensions of medieval fire culture tend to find it present in every stratum of society, from the formal theological references to light and warmth as divine qualities, to the folk practices that treated the hearth as a protected domestic spirit requiring specific acknowledgement and respect. Whether this reverence was primarily theological, primarily practical dressed in theological language, or something that existed in a register that did not cleanly separate the two, is a question that the evidence sustains in its ambiguity rather than resolving. People who live close enough to a forest to depend on it for survival tend to develop complex relationships with it. The medieval fire was not merely fuel. It was the line between the night being something you endured and something that ended you. That such a thing would accumulate meaning beyond its BTU output seems, from the inside of that experience, not only understandable but inevitable. Consider what the fire had witnessed in this chamber alone. The generations of sleepers who had drawn their curtains within its light. They raised beds off the floor to escape the coldest layer of air, which settled downward and pooled against the stone like an invisible flood. The children who had grown up watching its shadows. The old people who had warmed their hands at it in their last winters. The prayers said at its edge and the stories told by its glow. The servants who had risen at midnight to tend it and the morning faces that had turned toward it for the reassurance that the night was over and the warmth was available again. A fire in a medieval castle was not a modern appliance. It was a presence with a history, embedded in the life of the household in a way that made it difficult to separate from the people it had served. When contemporaries described it as the heart of the home, they were speaking more precisely than metaphor usually allows. Against all the cold that the building could produce, and the building could produce considerable cold, 12 feet of stone that had been accumulating it since October, drafts that found every gap in every curtain and every crack in every shutter, frost that formed on the inside of walls in January and on the fabric of bed canopies where human breath met cold air. Against all of that, the fire was what pushed back. Not very far. Not with anything approaching complete success. They sealed cracks with tow, moss, clay, whatever came to hand. But visibly, continuously, with a presence that the stone and the cold could not replicate. The cold was the castle's default condition. The fire was the argument against it. Every night was the same argument, made with the same tools, against the same opponent. And the fact that the argument had to be made again tomorrow did not diminish what it meant to be making it tonight. You watch the embers now, the room around you in the deep quiet of the last hours before dawn. The shadows move on the walls in the fire's slow language. Your breath is visible in the air above the bed, a thin fog that rises and disperses, testimony to the temperature of the chamber outside the curtains, which remains exactly what it has been all night. The fire does not fix this. It never did. But it is here. They stuffed rags into gaps around window frames and door edges with the methodical patience of people engaged in an ongoing negotiation with their own building. It has been here all night. It will be here in the morning, receiving its first new log of the day from the servant who rises before anyone else and performs the fundamental act of the household before any other task is possible. The cold is the condition. The fire is the refusal. In the long record of human winters, this refusal is everything. In this chamber, in this night, in this particular moment between the last sleep and the first light, it is enough. Let the pace slow now. Everything has been said that needs to be said. The cold has been accounted for, the preparations made, the fire tended and the prayers spoken and the dogs settled and the curtains drawn. The castle has done what castles do through the night, pressed its cold through every gap it could find, rattled its shutters, moved its shadows across walls made silver with frost. And you have done what people in castles have done for centuries, which is to refuse, with every available tool and layer and living creature, to let the cold be the last word. None of it solved the problem. Let your breathing slow now. The great hall is empty, its fire a memory of warmth that the stone is already forgetting. The guards on the walls are doing what guards on walls do in the cold hours, which is everything possible to remain upright and conscious and not become a cautionary tale that gets recorded in a chronicle. The servants in their lofts above the kitchen are folded into each other's warmth in ways they would probably not choose to describe if asked. The monks in their dormitory have completed the night office and returned to their rows of straw pallets, the bells that called them to prayer now silent. The hall's collective breathing resumed. The castle is as quiet as it gets, which is not entirely quiet. Stone buildings in cold weather speak their own language. The low vocabulary of contraction and settlement, the occasional crack of a beam finding a new position in the frost. the distant sound of wind testing the battlements with the persistence of something that has been doing this for a very long time and sees no reason to stop. You know these sounds now. You have cataloged them over months of winter nights until they belong to the background of sleep rather than the foreground of wakefulness. Let them recede. All of it made it marginally more survivable. The cold is still there on the other side of the curtains, pressed against the outside of the stone. It will be there in the morning, meeting the first servant who opens a door with the enthusiasm of something that has been waiting outside since October. This is simply true and has always been true and required no further engagement tonight. Inside the curtains, inside the layered blankets, inside the space that the bed and its curtains and the dog's warmth and the residual heat of the stone at your feet have collaborated to produce, in here, the temperature is different. Not warm by the standards of a heated room. Warm by the standards of what was available, which is the only standard that was ever being applied. Your limbs are heavy in the way that limbs are heavy when the body has accepted that the work of the day is finished and the work of the night has been sufficiently addressed. The wool against your skin has lost its scratch. It has been there long enough to become simply the surface of the world, unremarkable, present. The dog has settled into a position that suggests it does not intend to move until morning, which is the commitment level you were hoping for. Think for a moment of all of them. That distinction between solving and surviving is one that the medieval castle dweller understood with great clarity. The boy in the loft above the kitchen, curled on a straw pallet with his knees drawn up, his breath making small clouds in the air above him that dissolve before they can cool. He is not comfortable by any external measure. He is deeply, completely asleep, his body having decided that the warmth rising from the kitchen below is sufficient for its purposes and declined to remain conscious to worry about it. The grandmother by the cottage fire, her back to the room, her face to the embers. She has been sleeping this way for decades. The fire knows her breathing. She knows the fire's sounds. Between them, an agreement has been reached that the night will not be worse than last night, which was not worse than the night before, which is how winters are survived. Not in the aggregate, but one night at a time. Each one negotiated separately. Each one added to the count of nights that have been gotten through. The monk in the dormitory row, his thin blanket pulled to his chin, the communal warmth of 40 sleeping bodies doing the work that his single blanket cannot do alone. He will rise again before dawn. The cold was not going to be defeated. He knows this. The knowledge does not prevent sleep. Nothing about the medieval night was designed to make sleep easy, and sleep came anyway, because the body's need for it was greater than any obstacle the night could arrange. The pilgrim in the stable, pressed against hay bales with the horse's warmth radiating through the wall between them. He is thinking about tomorrow's road. Then he is not thinking about anything. The nobleman in his solar, the curtains drawn, the warmed stone at his feet still releasing the last of its heat into the bedclothes. The dog a solid weight against his legs. He has made every preparation available to him. The cold outside his curtains is doing what cold does, which is everything it can within the available physics, and the preparations he has made are doing what they can within the available resources, and the balance between these two forces has, tonight, once again resolved in his favor, as it has for every winter he can remember. The question was only how much ground you could take back from it each night before exhaustion made the argument moot, as it did for every winter that came before the ones he can remember. Let the sounds of the castle soften now. The fire speaks in its low, contented voice, the voice of a fire that has been fed and is doing its work. The curtains hang still in the absence of drafts, not because the drafts are gone, but because the night has settled into its deep hours where even the wind takes a breath. The rushes on the floor are quiet. The dog exhales once, slowly, the sound of something that has decided the situation is satisfactory and is acting accordingly. Your thoughts, which have been moving through centuries of stone and cold and human ingenuity, begin to lose their edges. The French Duchess and her dismantled bed, the guards upright in the Flemish frost, the grandmother in the bakehouse. You reach the door of your chamber. The Italian cousin trembling toward dawn, the monks in their rows, The pilgrims in their stables, the children swaddled near the fire, the elderly moved to smaller chambers for the winter, the servants rising at midnight to feed the logs, the warming pans and the spiced wine, and the herbs in the rushes, and the iron knife under the pillow, and the three saints' names spoken into the dark before the candle went out. All of it in service of the same thing. This, the weight of the blankets settling. The dog's warmth, constant. The fire's low voice. The darkness behind your eyelids, which is the same darkness as the darkness in the room, and neither of them is frightening now. The cold is the condition. The fire is the refusal. The iron handle is cold enough to sting through your glove. And sleep, fought for, earned, engineered from wool and fur and dogs and prayers and the accumulated knowledge of every winter that came before this one. Sleep is the victory. Not a permanent victory. Tomorrow night the argument begins again, as it began again every night for everyone who ever slept in a stone building in January, as it will begin again for you. But tonight the argument has been made. Tonight the preparations held. Tonight the cold did not win. Let your breathing slow to the pace of something that has set down its work for the night. Let the sounds of the castle become the sounds of the background, then the sounds of a dream, then nothing in particular. The fire will be here when you wake. The cold will be here when you wake. You push it open, step inside, and your breath immediately clouds in front of you like a small flag of surrender. Between them, in the curtained warmth of the bed that someone built and someone warmed and someone tended through the night, you will be here when you wake. That is enough. That has always been enough. Rest now. The walls glisten faintly with moisture. Somewhere outside, the wind finds a gap in the shutters and makes its opinion known. You begin the familiar calculation of how many layers are going to be enough tonight, and whether the answer is going to be the same as last night, which was not entirely sufficient. Your boots hit the floor of the chamber and something crunches softly beneath them. Not ice, not yet anyway. Rushes. A layer of dried grasses and river plants scattered across the stone flags in a mat that is doing its modest best to stand between your feet and one of the coldest surfaces in the building. It is not a carpet. It is not insulation in any sense that would satisfy a modern building inspector. It is, essentially, a thin agreement between the inhabitants of this room and the floor, with both parties aware that the floor is winning. And yet the rushes were not nothing. Households took them seriously enough to replace them several times a year, which is more maintenance than most medieval furnishings received. When freshly laid, they released a faint green smell, earthy, slightly damp, carrying a suggestion of the riverbank they came from. For a day or two, walking across them felt almost pleasant, the stone beneath them muffled, the air carrying something that was not smoke or cold damp for once. You could almost convince yourself it was summer if you concentrated very hard and ignored everything else about the room. The practical logic was sound, if limited. A thick layer of rushes created a thin buffer between human feet and stone that had spent the night radiating cold upward. It absorbed the moisture that condensed on the floor, and there was always moisture in every season, but especially in winter, preventing the flags from becoming a continuous shallow ice rink by January. It softened footsteps and muffled the echo that bare stone produced, which made the chamber feel marginally less like the interior of a very large drinking vessel. Some households went further. Herbs were scattered among the rushes. Lavender, rosemary, meadowsweet gathered in summer and dried for this purpose. The idea was partly practical, partly optimistic. The fragrance masked what the rushes would eventually become, buying a few extra days of civility before reality reasserted itself. Walking across a freshly herbed floor released a brief, surprisingly pleasant scent into the air, clean and slightly sharp against the background of smoke and damp wool that constituted the room's default atmosphere. The background always won, because here's what happened to rushes over time, and this is not a flattering account. The food scraps that fell from tables and were not retrieved by dogs, of which there were many, this being before the invention of both napkins as a concept and adequate lighting, worked their way into the mat. Spilled ale soaked in and stayed. Bones from previous meals lodged themselves in the deeper layers. Mice treated the rushes as a combined restaurant and residence. Insects found the warm, damp, food-rich environment extremely agreeable and moved in without being asked. By the end of winter, a floor that had begun the season smelling of riverbanks smelled of something considerably less pleasant. A French moralist of the period, not a man given to understatement, compared the state of end-of-season rushes to sleeping in a midden. The herbs were long gone. The freshness was a memory. What remained was a biological record of every meal, every spill, and every passing creature since the last time someone had the energy to sweep it all out and start again. Architectural historians still disagree about how much the rushes actually helped with warmth. Some argue that a sufficiently thick mat of dried plant material created genuine insulation, measurably reducing heat loss through the floor. Others contend that the benefit was largely psychological, that the real heat loss was through walls and ceiling, and that the rushes were addressing the wrong problem with a lot of effort and a predictably unsatisfying outcome. The evidence, as with so many aspects of medieval domestic life, is incomplete enough to support both positions comfortably. What is not in dispute is that people bothered. Generation after generation, across centuries of medieval winters, someone hauled rushes in from outside, spread them across stone floors, scattered herbs among them, and believed, or at least hoped, that it was making some difference. That consistent effort, that refusal to simply accept the cold floor as an immovable fact, reveals something about the medieval approach to discomfort. You did not have to solve a problem entirely to consider it worth addressing. You gathered what you had, spread it across what was hurting you, and called it progress. You scuff your boot through the rushes now, releasing a faint, complicated smell. Grass beneath, something less identifiable above it, and the ghost of rosemary somewhere in the middle. A mouse pauses near the wall, reassesses the situation, and disappears. The floor is not warm, but it is fractionally less cold than the stone beneath it. In the hierarchy of medieval victories over the cold, this counts. You cross the chamber and sit on the edge of the bed. Beneath your hands, layers of cloth are piled with the kind of deliberate excess that stops being about comfort and starts being about survival strategy. This is not a bed that has been made. It is a bed that has been constructed. The foundation is linen. Smooth, relatively fine, cool against the skin. It was the baseline of any respectable medieval sleeping arrangement, the layer closest to the body. Linen had practical advantages that wool did not. It laundered more readily, which mattered in a world where bedding absorbed everything the room produced. Smoke, damp, the accumulated evidence of human habitation, and needed to be cleaned with some regularity if the sleeper was to maintain any pretense of hygiene. Against bare skin, it felt smooth rather than abrasive, which counted for something in an age when most textiles had the texture of mild aggression. But linen was not warm. Everyone knew this. The warmth came from what went on top of it. Woolen blankets were piled in layers, each one heavy enough to be noticeable. The cumulative weight of several of them substantial enough that contemporary accounts compared it to having a large dog lie across you. Which was also, as it happens, sometimes literally true, but that comes later. The wool was coarse by modern standards, carrying the lanolin smell of the sheep it had recently been part of and a faint dampness that never entirely left it regardless of how long it had been indoors. It scratched. It itched. It was, nonetheless, the primary mechanism between a sleeping human and a potentially fatal night, and so its qualities as a textile were considered secondary to its qualities as a barrier. Over the wool, if you had the wealth and the connections and the willingness to spend accordingly, came fur. This is where the medieval bed departed from mere practicality and entered the territory of serious investment. Fox pelts, marten skins, sable bear. The range of animals represented in noble bedding inventories reads like a fairly comprehensive survey of European wildlife. Ermine appeared on the finest coverlets, its white fur carrying both exceptional warmth and the kind of social signaling that made clear to any observer exactly where in the hierarchy the sleeper resided. A bed dressed in ermine was not making a subtle point. But fur was not only about status, whatever the historians arguing the opposite might suggest. It worked. Dense animal pelts trapped air in a way that woven wool could not entirely replicate. creating an insulating layer that genuinely made a difference in a room where the temperature hovered near freezing. A noble woman in Burgundy, recorded in a period account, refused to travel without her ermine-lined coverlet even in summer, citing a profound and apparently non-negotiable anxiety about nocturnal chills. To a modern reader, this sounds eccentric. To anyone who has spent a night in a stone room in January, it sounds like good planning. The servants, meanwhile, had opinions about all of this. A dry aside survives in several household accounts, describing masters so thoroughly buried under their bedding that turning over required what was described as a monumental effort. The image is not unpleasant. A nobleman pinned to his mattress by the collective weight of 5 blankets and a fur coverlet, unable to change position without effectively dismantling his own sleeping arrangement. Warmth, it turned out, came at the cost of mobility. Most people considered this an acceptable trade-off, given that the alternative was being cold and mobile in a freezing room at 3 in the morning. There was also a layer of folk theory underneath the practical layering. Some households operated on the belief that linen, being cool by nature, actively drew heat away from the body. That sleeping directly against it without sufficient wool above was to invite the cold in through the sheets themselves. The remedy was the textile sandwich: linen against the skin, wool layered above and below it, fur sealing everything in from the top. Whether this reflected any genuine understanding of thermal dynamics is doubtful. Whether it reflected the desperate creativity of people who spent a lot of time being cold and were willing to try most things is not in question at all. What the layers produced at their best was a cocoon, not a comfortable one in any modern sense. The wool itched, the fur smelled of its previous owners, the whole arrangement pressed down with a weight that made spontaneous movement inadvisable. But inside it, the body's own heat had a chance. It accumulated rather than dissipating immediately into the surrounding stone. It built, slowly, into something that could be mistaken for warmth if you were sufficiently tired and sufficiently committed to the idea. The medieval sleeper did not simply go to bed. They armored themselves. Each layer of fabric was a decision, a small, deliberate act of resistance against the room around them. To sleep was to build a fortress inside a fortress, not from stone and mortar, but from sheep and foxes, and the accumulated ingenuity of generations who had faced the same cold and arrived at the same conclusions. You run your hand across the top layer now. The fur is dense and slightly coarse, carrying the faint musk of animal and the sharper edge of smoke. Beneath it, the wool is heavy, the linen below that smooth and cool. The window shutter rattles once in a gust of wind and goes quiet. You contemplate the layers, and the layers contemplate you. Eventually, one of you is going to have to climb in. Now look at the bed itself. Not the bedding, the structure. Because the 4-poster canopy bed was not primarily a piece of furniture. It was an engineering solution to an architectural problem. And the problem was that someone had built your bedroom out of stone and forgotten to include any warmth. The frame rose from the floor on 4 carved posts, oak or walnut, solid enough to outlast several generations of the family sleeping in them, often ornately worked with figures and foliage that represented a considerable investment of skilled labor. But the decoration was incidental. The posts existed to hold the canopy above, and the canopy existed to hold the curtains, and the curtains existed to do something that all the stone and mortar of the castle around you had conspicuously failed to do: create an enclosed space that a human body could actually warm. Draw the curtains around a 4-poster bed and you have, in effect, erected a small tent inside your bedroom. The physics are straightforward. Your body produces heat continuously. In an open room, that heat disperses immediately into a volume of cold air too large for any single human to influence. Inside the curtained bed, the volume is reduced to something manageable, a space roughly the size of a generous wardrobe. And the heat you produce has nowhere to go. It accumulates. It lingers. It turns what would otherwise be a brief and miserable interlude of cold sheets into something that, within 20 minutes or so, approaches tolerable. The curtains themselves were not thin decorative panels. They were heavy, layered, substantial things. Wool, linen, sometimes lined with additional fabric for extra resistance to drafts. In some documented cases, they were waxed or treated with oiled cloth to block cold air more effectively, the medieval equivalent of weatherproofing. When drawn closed, they muffled sound, blocked light, and created a darkness inside the bed that was almost absolute. The chamber beyond ceased to exist in any meaningful sensory way. What remained was the sound of your own breathing, the weight of blankets, and the gradual, deeply satisfying process of the air around you deciding to be warm. That a French duchess of the period traveled with her bed dismantled and loaded onto carts tells you everything you need to know about how seriously this piece of furniture was taken. This was not sentimentality about a familiar mattress. The bed was infrastructure. To sleep in an unfamiliar castle without your own canopy and curtains was to face the night with your primary defense missing. Like a knight who had remembered his sword but left his armor at home. The inconvenience of transporting a disassembled four-poster across several days of medieval road was, apparently, considerably preferable to the alternative. The curtains also solved a secondary problem that the architects had created along with the primary one. Castle chambers were rarely private in any meaningful sense. Servants moved through them. Companions slept nearby. The household operated around and sometimes within the sleeping space of its senior members with a casualness about personal boundaries that would strike the modern mind as remarkable. The drawn curtains of the bed created, if not true privacy, at least the convincing illusion of it. A visual and acoustic boundary that the conventions of the household generally treated as a closed door, even when no door existed. Whether the curtains provided warmth in a strictly measurable physical sense, or whether their greatest contribution was psychological, the sensation of enclosure, of shelter, of having drawn a boundary between yourself and the hostile room, is a question that scholars have not finished debating. The answer is probably both, weighted differently depending on the quality of the curtains, the severity of the night, and how charitably you are inclined to view the evidence. What is not debated is that people believed in the beds profoundly, traveled with them, commissioned them, recorded them carefully in inventories, and passed them down as significant possessions. In a world that offered very little control over the temperature of the room you slept in, the four-poster gave you control over the temperature of a much smaller room inside it. The castle might be a refrigerator. The bed was the argument against that. You reach out now and take the edge of the curtain between your fingers. The fabric is heavy, slightly rough, carrying the layered smell of the room. Smoke, wool, the faint beeswax of the canopy frame. You pull it across and the chamber disappears. Inside, the air is already fractionally different. Stiller? Less hostile. The draft that has been finding your neck since you came upstairs goes quiet. Outside the curtain, the castle continues being cold. It will be cold all night. It will be cold tomorrow. But in here, just in here, the geometry is finally working in your favor. The curtains are drawn. The layers are piled, but underneath all of it, underneath every strategy and every careful arrangement of wool and fur and waxed linen, there is still the question of what you are actually lying on. Because the surface between your body and the bed frame was not a neutral fact. It was a decision, and like most decisions in medieval life, it reflected exactly where you stood in the order of things. At the top of the hierarchy sat the feather bed. This was not a mattress in any modern sense. It was a large sack, linen usually well-stitched and carefully maintained, stuffed with the down of geese or ducks until it achieved a depth that contemporary accounts described with something approaching reverence. A well-filled feather bed sat nearly a foot above the frame, a soft, yielding, slightly improbable object in a room that was otherwise composed entirely of hard surfaces. To lower yourself onto one was to sink, the down compressing and reshaping around your body with a hospitality that nothing else in the castle offered. Noble households listed their feather beds in inventories with the same careful attention they gave to silver plate and good horses. They were transported when the household moved, stored with deliberate care when not in use, repaired when the stitching failed, and passed down through wills as possessions of genuine value. A feather bed was not simply furniture. It was an inheritance. It represented the accumulated plumage of a significant number of birds and the accumulated wealth of a family that could afford to keep it. It was also, in the wrong conditions, suffocating. A letter survives from a 15th century guest, a man of sufficient standing to be sleeping on a feather bed in the first place, which limits our sympathy somewhat, complaining with vivid specificity about the experience of being, as he put it, swallowed like a goose in a pot. Too many feathers, too deep a sink, and the sleeper found themselves not resting on a surface but engulfed by one. The down closed around them. The body heat that the feather bed was so efficient at trapping became, by the middle of the night, a liability. You could not turn without effort. You could not find a cool patch of surface because there was no surface, only more down, pressing back, warm and relentless. That the same property that made feather beds valuable in January made them oppressive in an overheated room was an irony that users apparently accepted as the cost of luxury. Better to wrestle with your mattress at midnight than to lie on what waited at the bottom of the hierarchy. The straw tick was, to put it plainly, the feather bed's less distinguished cousin. A large sack, coarser fabric, less careful stitching, filled with straw, hay, reeds, or whatever dried plant material was available and affordable, which in most cases meant whatever grew nearby. Peasants used them. Soldiers used them. The lesser chambers of castles were furnished with them. They were cheap, easily replaced, and adequate in the way that things are adequate when the alternative is the bare floor. They were also, without exception, a compromise. Straw flattened under body weight with the speed of something that had never had any intention of maintaining its shape. The filling poked through the cloth at the seams and abraded whatever skin it contacted. It harbored fleas with a generosity that seemed almost deliberate, and the standard maintenance procedure, beating the sack vigorously to reflate and dislodge the inhabitants, was a regular domestic chore of the more thankless variety. By morning, after a full night of compression and occupancy, the straw tick had subsided into a thin, uneven mat that bore only a theoretical resemblance to the sleeping surface it had been at the start. Some households mixed dried herbs into the straw, lavender, mint, pennyroyal, both to soften the smell and to discourage the insects that considered the filling their permanent address. This helped briefly in the way that most brief solutions to ongoing problems help. The herbs provided a few days of fragrance before the straw reasserted its essential character, which was earthy, slightly sour, and completely indifferent to your comfort. Historians continue to debate how widely feather beds were actually distributed across medieval society. Some argue they were confined to the genuinely wealthy, a luxury of the upper tier, inaccessible to anyone without significant resources. Others point to household accounts and wills from middling families that include feather beds among their recorded possessions, suggesting the market extended further down the social scale than the luxury framing implies. The evidence is patchy enough to support both positions without definitively settling either. What is settled is that the mattress you slept on told the room, and anyone who might be observing, exactly who you were. To sink into feathers was to belong to the world of plenty. To endure straw was to belong to the world of making do. Both were responses to the same cold chamber, the same stone floor beneath the frame, the same indifferent winter pressing in through the walls. You settle back now, and the surface beneath you makes its nature immediately clear. Whether it yields and cradles or resists and pokes, the negotiation has begun. The blankets above adjust to the new arrangement. The curtains hang still around you. Outside the bed, the room is exactly as cold as it was. Inside it, the process of persuading your body that sleep is possible has begun, 1 degree at a time. Even the best constructed bed, with its curtains drawn and its layers piled and its mattress doing its imperfect best, had one fundamental limitation. It could only work with what you gave it. And a single human body, lying alone in a stone chamber, produced a limited amount of heat. Enough to warm a small enclosed space eventually, but slowly, and with no margin for error on the coldest nights. The medieval solution to this was straightforward, practical, and entirely without the self-consciousness that modern sensibilities might bring to it. You did not sleep alone if you could avoid it. The warmth of another body was not a luxury or an intimacy. It was arithmetic. Noble households arranged this with the careful pragmatism of people who understood the stakes. Servants slept on pallets at the foot of the master's bed, or in an adjoining alcove, or on the floor of the chamber itself, close enough that their body heat contributed to the room's marginal warmth, close enough to be useful if anything was needed in the night. The arrangement was described in household accounts as a matter of service and security, which it was. It was also, less formally acknowledged, a matter of degrees. More bodies in a room meant a higher ambient temperature. Everyone understood this. Not everyone said it directly. In monasteries, the logic was stripped of even the pretense of other purposes. Monks slept in long dormitory halls, their cots or straw pallets arranged in rows close enough that the breathing of the next man was audible. The monastic rules that prescribed this arrangement cited discipline, community, and the prevention of private vice. But the practical effect was a room full of sleeping bodies generating collective heat in a space that would otherwise have been brutal. A chronicler of the period observed, with the dry accuracy of someone who had spent winters in both environments, that the cloister was warmer than the Lord's tower, for the monks lay together like sheaves. It was not a romantic image. It was a thermal one. Soldiers in castle barracks achieved the same result with less ceremony. Long rows of men on straw beds, cloaks pulled over as additional covering, weapons stacked within reach. The smell was substantial. The warmth was real. After a day of physical labor in cold weather, the question of whether you would prefer more personal space was answered quickly and consistently in favor of not freezing. The 14th century English nobleman whose will granted his favored squire a permanent place near the Lord's chamber fire was, scholars suggest, conferring something more layered than simple favor. Access to warmth was privilege. To be invited into the heated inner circle of a household, literally and architecturally, was a mark of standing that had material consequences. The cold sorted people as efficiently as any feudal ranking, and position near the fire reflected position in the order of things. For those at the lower end of both hierarchies, bed sharing was not a question of preference at all. It was simply what happened. Families in peasant cottages slept together as a matter of course. Parents, children, grandparents, occasionally an elderly relative who had no other reasonable option. Their combined warmth under a shared heap of blankets making the night survivable in a way that no individual's resources alone could have managed. Privacy was a concept that belonged to people with enough rooms to afford it, and enough fuel to heat those rooms individually. For everyone else, closeness was the solution, and the solution worked. The disadvantages were real and not worth minimizing. Shared sleeping spaces spread fleas, lice, and illness with democratic efficiency. Whatever one person carried into the bed, everyone else would encounter before morning. Coughs and snoring disrupted sleep. Elbows arrived unexpectedly in the dark. Children, in particular, seemed to operate on the theory that a shared bed was an invitation to redistribute themselves across the entire available surface regardless of existing occupants. None of this altered the fundamental calculation. On a night when the temperature inside a stone chamber dropped toward freezing, the choice between discomfort and danger was made quickly and consistently. You chose the discomfort. You pulled the blanket over yourself, and whoever was beside you felt the gradual accumulation of shared warmth, listened to the breathing of your companions slow into sleep, and allowed yourself to be persuaded that the night was going to be survivable after all. The castle around you was indifferent to whether you survived it. The people in the bed with you were not. You settled deeper into the mattress now, aware of the space beside you, the redistributed warmth, the quiet sound of another person's breathing somewhere nearby. The curtains hang still. The cold presses against the outside of them and finds no purchase. The arithmetic for tonight is in your favor. And then there is the weight at your feet. It arrived sometime after you drew the curtains. A solid, warm, unreasonably comfortable presence pressing against your legs with the quiet confidence of something that has done this before and intends to do it again. It sighs once, shifts slightly and settles. The cold that was making determined progress toward your toes retreats. It is a dog. Possibly two. On a genuinely bad night, three. The use of dogs as sleeping companions in medieval households was not sentiment dressed up as practicality, nor practicality dressed up as sentiment. It was both, simultaneously, in proportions that varied by household and by the severity of the January in question. Dogs were working animals, hunters, guards, herders, but their role in the bedchamber was thermal. A large hound generates a meaningful amount of heat. Pressed against human feet beneath several layers of blanket in an enclosed curtained bed, it generates enough to constitute a genuine contribution to the night's survival prospects. Noble households kept dogs in numbers that modern pet ownership would find difficult to accommodate, and the line between the dogs that lived in the hall and the dogs that ended up in the bed was, in practice, quite permeable. Inventories and household accounts make passing reference to favored animals sleeping in their master's chambers with the casualness of people describing an arrangement too obvious to require explanation. Small lapdogs were gifted to noble women with the explicit understanding that their role included warming their owner's bed. Pampered, perfumed, occasionally dressed in their own small garments, but fundamentally present for the same reason as everyone and everything else in a medieval winter chamber: heat. Larger breeds served the same purpose with less ceremony. A pair of mastiffs stretched across the bottom of a curtained bed, their dense coats radiating warmth through the blankets, their weight a reassuring pressure against cold feet. This was not an indulgence. This was a technology. It happened to have a wet nose and an enthusiasm for mealtimes, but its primary winter function was identical to the heated stone wrapped in cloth that sat on the other side of the bed. A French proverb of the period stated that a faithful dog keeps the frost away from his master's heart. The line works on both levels simultaneously, which is how the best proverbs operate. The dog kept the frost away from the heart in the straightforward physical sense of being warm and present in a cold room. It also kept it away in the other sense, the long, silent midwinter nights in a drafty stone castle being considerably more bearable with a living creature beside you than without one. The phrase three-dog night, though coined much later and in a different context, captures the medieval reality with reasonable accuracy. One dog meant the night was cold but manageable. Two meant it was serious. Three meant you had reassessed the situation and concluded that every available thermal resource should be deployed without embarrassment. The number of dogs in the bed was, in effect, a weather report. Travelers encountered the same principle in less domestic forms. In inns of variable quality, guests sometimes found themselves sleeping in stables, an arrangement that sounds like a humiliation until you understand the thermal logic. Horses, cattle, and livestock in a confined space produce extraordinary amounts of heat. Pilgrims traveling the Camino de Santiago wrote of choosing stalls over guest rooms with the pragmatic satisfaction of people who had done the calculation and found the hay more persuasive than the mattress. The smell was considerable. The warmth was not in question. The debate among historians about how widespread and how socially accepted animal bed sharing was among the nobility tends to resolve, on examination, into a debate about how much the sources reflect actual practice versus idealized presentation. Formal household accounts describe arrangements with some decorum. Personal letters and incidental references describe arrangements with considerably less. The gap between them suggests that what happened in the curtained privacy of a noble bed and what was considered appropriate to record were not always the same thing. For everyone below the nobility, the question did not arise. Animals lived in close proximity to people because the proximity was practical, and the alternative, animals housed separately in winter conditions, was a waste of heat that nobody could afford. Families in peasant cottages shared their living space with livestock as a matter of course, the warmth of the animals raising the ambient temperature of the dwelling measurably. To sleep near a cow was not degrading. It was sensible. The cow was warm. The night was cold. The mathematics were uncomplicated. You feel the weight shift at your feet now. A small adjustment, a deeper settling. And the warmth that follows is immediate and specific and entirely welcome. Outside the curtains, the chamber is doing what it has been doing since October. Inside the bed, the accumulated warmth of bodies and blankets and one entirely untroubled animal has produced something that, by the standards available, counts as comfort. The dog exhales slowly. You follow its example. Step outside the castle for a moment. Not far. Just across the frozen courtyard, through the gate, and down the slope to where the village begins. The houses here are low, timber-framed, their walls packed with daub, their roofs thick with thatch that has been accumulating for years. From the outside, they look humble in the way that things look humble when they are being compared to a castle. From the inside, on a January night, they tell a different story. The question of who actually slept warmer in medieval winter, the lord in his castle or the peasant in his cottage, is one that historians approach with some caution. because the answer is not the one the social hierarchy would prefer. The evidence, such as it is, suggests that the peasant's case was often stronger than it had any right to be, given the relative grandeur of the available options. The physics were straightforward, even if the implications were awkward. A noble chamber was large, enormously, pointlessly, architecturally large, ceilinged high enough to make any fire's heat rise immediately away from the people who needed it. Floored in stone that had been cold since the foundations were laid, walled in 12 feet of rock that maintained its temperature with the stubbornness of something that had never been asked to do otherwise. Into this space, a single fireplace discharged its heat upward and outward, the vast majority of it disappearing before it reached anyone. The room swallowed warmth the way the sea swallows a dropped coin. Completely. Without acknowledgement. A peasant cottage operated on entirely different principles. The ceiling was low. The floor space was small, sometimes a single room housing an entire family and occasionally their most cold-sensitive animals as well. A single central hearth in this context was not fighting a losing battle against cubic footage. It was heating a space scaled to be heatable, and it was doing so with the assistance of every body in the room, human and otherwise. The combined warmth of a family pressed together on a straw mattress near a fire, in a thatched space that insulated from above and retained heat from below, produced results that the most lavishly appointed castle chamber could not reliably match. A visitor to a 14th century English village wrote, with the mild astonishment of someone whose expectations have just been revised, that the huts were mean but held warmth far better than the Lord's Tower. It is the kind of observation that sounds like a compliment and reads like an indictment. The nobility had advantages, and they were real. The quality of their textiles was genuinely superior. Wool of finer grade, furs of greater density, linen softened by repeated washing rather than stiffened by infrequent use. A noble's bed, fully furnished with ermine coverlets and layered blankets and waxed curtains, represented an investment in warmth that no peasant household could replicate. The warming pan that preheated their sheets, the servants who tended their fire through the night, the solar chamber oriented toward the southern sun. These things mattered and should not be dismissed. But the peasant had the cottage. And the cottage, being small and low and packed with the body heat of everyone who lived in it, had a thermal efficiency that the castle's grandeur actively undermined. The thatched roof, several feet thick with compressed straw and organic matter, insulated with a reliability that bare stone battlements never could. The animals stalled at one end of the building. A cow, some sheep, whatever livestock was too valuable to risk in a separate outbuilding, contributed warmth with the indifference of creatures unaware they were performing a service. Peasants sometimes slept directly on benches pulled close to the hearth, accepting the risk of sparks and smoke in exchange for the immediate heat of the flames. The calculation was deliberate. Better to wake occasionally to brush an ember from your sleeve than to lie all night in the cold reaches of a room too large to heat. In the castle above, the Lord made the same calculation from the opposite direction, accepting the architectural grandeur of a space that could not be warmed in exchange for the status that required the space to exist. The debate among historians about whether wealth automatically purchased better sleep has the quality of a question where everyone involved suspects what the answer is, but would prefer more evidence before committing to it. Some argue firmly that the volume of textiles available to the nobility compensated for the thermal failures of the architecture. Others point at the documentary record, the letters complaining of frozen wash basins, the accounts of frost on bed curtains, the visitors noting that they had not slept warmly in a castle since arriving, and suggest that compensation is not the same as solution. Both are probably right, depending on the night, the castle, the cottage, and the winter. What neither side disputes is the irony. The social order of medieval Europe placed the lord above the peasant in every meaningful category of power, wealth, and privilege. In one specific category, the likelihood of waking warm, the peasant in his low, smoky, animal-scented, thatch-roofed hut had at least an arguable case for the better arrangement. Nobody mentioned this to the lord. You think about it now, though, lying in your curtained bed with the castle performing its usual impressions of a large outdoor space that happens to have a roof. Somewhere down the hill, a family is sleeping in a room the size of your bedchamber's fireplace, and they are almost certainly warmer than you are. The tapestries are very fine, though. The bed is where it is tonight. But it was not always where it is, and come spring, it will not be where it is now either. Because one of the less obvious survival strategies available to medieval castle dwellers was the one that involved picking up the entire bedroom and moving it to a different part of the building. This was not metaphorical. Noble households migrated within their own walls with the seasonal regularity of something that had thought carefully about solar angles and prevailing winds, and arrived at the conclusion that commitment to a single chamber was for people who had not yet spent a winter in the north wing. The castle was large. Not all of it faced the same direction. Not all of it caught the same thin winter sun. And the difference between a room that received a few hours of pale January light on its southern wall and a room that received none was, in the arithmetic of medieval warmth, significant enough to justify the considerable effort of moving a disassembled four-poster bed, several large tapestries, and the accumulated furnishings of a household from one end of a building to the other. Winter chambers were chosen for southern exposure. The reasoning was not complicated. South-facing walls caught whatever weak sun the season offered, stored a marginal amount of warmth in the stone over the course of the day, and released it with almost imperceptible generosity into the room overnight. This was not heating in any meaningful modern sense. It was the difference between a wall that was extremely cold and a wall that was slightly less extremely cold. In January, that distinction was worth acting on. Summer chambers ran in the opposite direction. North-facing rooms, darker and cooler, became the preference once the sun had enough strength to make southern rooms genuinely uncomfortable. The household reversed its migration. Tapestries came down from one set of walls and went up on another, and the seasonal cycle of the castle's interior life repeated itself with the resignation of people who had accepted that their home required active management to be habitable. The household accounts of Edward IV document this practice with the bureaucratic thoroughness of a court that kept records of everything. Beds were dismantled. Feather mattresses were carried through corridors on the shoulders of servants who had presumably made peace with this being their situation. Linens were aired, refolded, and redistributed. Tapestries of considerable size and weight were unpinned from one set of walls and rehung on another. The operation had the scale of a small military logistics exercise and was conducted with comparable seriousness, because the alternative was the king sleeping in a room that was several degrees colder than necessary, which was the kind of oversight that reflected poorly on everyone involved. A Burgundian courtier, a man of sufficient standing to have views about which chamber he slept in and sufficient influence to act on them, left a letter describing the year his usual winter room became, as he put it, lost to the frost. The walls had grown so damp and cold that he had relocated himself, with some indignation, to a narrower room on the eastern side of the building that at least greeted him with the rising sun each morning. He described the frost-claimed chamber in the tone of someone discussing territory surrendered to an enemy force. The castle had, in his framing, won that room. He had retreated to negotiate better terms elsewhere. Whether this kind of deliberate seasonal rotation was available to most castle inhabitants, or only to those at the top of the household hierarchy, is a question that architectural historians continue to discuss with the tentativeness appropriate to incomplete evidence. Some argue that the positioning of fireplaces and windows in surviving castle structures suggests intentional design for seasonal use, that builders thought about solar orientation and prevailing winds when planning interiors, even if they never quite solved the fundamental problem of building comfortable homes out of stone. Others maintain that most castle residents had little choice about which room they occupied and simply endured wherever they were assigned, the seasonal migration being a luxury of the very wealthy rather than a general practice. The peasant equivalent was simpler in execution and identical in principle. Winter meant sleeping as close to the hearth as the family's geometry allowed. Summer meant retreating to a loft above the main room, or to a barn, or to wherever the air was coolest. The migration covered shorter distances and required considerably less logistics, but it was the same instinct. Read the building, find the warmth, move toward it with the season, move away when the season changes. Imagine the process now. Autumn arriving, the angle of the light shifting, the first genuine cold of the year finding its way into the chamber you have occupied since May. A servant comes to begin the dismantling. The curtains of the bed come down first, unhooked and folded with the care of things that will need to work well in a few hours. The posts are separated from the frame. The mattress is carried out. The tapestries, heavy, slightly dusty, woven with the hunting scene that has been watching you sleep since spring, come off the walls and are rolled for transport. 2 corridors and a staircase later, the winter chamber receives them. The walls are bare stone for perhaps an hour while the tapestries go up, and in that hour, the room looks exactly like what it is. A stone box with a fireplace and a draft problem. Then the fabric goes up, the bed goes back together, the mattress settles onto the frame, and the room becomes, with some effort and goodwill, a place that a person might sleep in. The sun will reach this wall tomorrow morning. Not for long. Not warmly, by any standard that would satisfy anyone accustomed to central heating. But enough. Enough to remind the stone that it has obligations. Enough to take the very sharpest edge off the night that follows. In the hierarchy of medieval strategies against the cold, moving the bedroom ranks somewhere between the genuinely clever and the quietly desperate. It solved nothing permanently. It made everything marginally better, which was, in the end, the best outcome most medieval winters were prepared to offer. While the tapestries are going up and the bed is being reassembled, take a moment to consider the window. It is, in the context of everything else this chamber is dealing with, a special kind of problem. The window is a hole in a 12-foot stone wall. It was put there to admit light and, in military necessity, to allow arrows to be fired outward at people approaching with bad intentions. What it was not designed to do, and what it has never managed to do despite various attempts, is keep the cold out. Every solution applied to it has been a negotiation rather than a resolution. A series of increasingly creative arguments with a gap in the wall that has the structural advantage of being a gap in a wall. Glass in most castle chambers was not an option. It existed, but it was expensive enough to be reserved for spaces that justified the investment. Chapels, oratories, the occasional great hall window where the display of wealth was worth the cost. Ordinary sleeping chambers made do with what was available, which was less impressive and considerably less effective. Wooden shutters were the standard answer. Thick planks, fitted to the window frame and barred from inside, they blocked the worst of the rain and, on calm nights, most of the wind. On nights that were not calm, which, in a castle built on an exposed hilltop specifically for its exposure, was a meaningful proportion of all nights. They rattled, groaned, admitted drafts through every imperfection in their fit, and reminded their occupants at regular intervals that a plank of wood and the outside world were separated by less than anyone would prefer. The next step up was cloth. Linen soaked in oil or wax was stretched across the window opening and tacked to the frame, creating a surface that was translucent rather than transparent. The world outside visible as shapes and suggestions rather than clear images. Light entering as a diffuse amber glow like sunlight through old parchment. By day, this produced a dim, warm-toned interior light that was actually rather pleasant. By night, it reduced the wind noise slightly, dampened the draft to something more like a persistent, cool presence than a direct assault, and flapped gently in the remaining air movement as a continuous reminder that the solution was imperfect. It was imperfect. Everything was imperfect. The question was only the degree. Horn windows represented the most sophisticated, widely available option for those who could obtain them. Thin slices of animal horn, cattle usually, were scraped until they achieved a pale translucency, then cut and fitted into wooden frames in sections. The result admitted a wan, slightly yellowed light and provided a more durable barrier than oiled cloth. Horn resisted rain without becoming waterlogged. It held its shape better in wind. It was also prone to yellowing further with age, and to warping as it dried and contracted, and to providing a view of the outside world that can most generously be described as impressionistic. Looking through horn windows was like seeing the world through slightly frosted glass during an overcast afternoon. The outlines were there. The details were a matter of inference. On moonlit winter nights, the distortion produced a quality of light inside the chamber that was eerie and not entirely unpleasant. The courtyard outside rendered in soft, uncertain shapes, the snow a pale blur, the world beyond the glass made strange and slightly removed. Whether horn windows were common across the range of castle chambers or confined to the wealthiest and most carefully appointed households is a question the archaeological record has not settled definitively. The materials do not survive well. The frames rot, the horn degrades, and what remains is the occasional reference in accounts and the inference from window dimensions. Some historians argue they were widespread enough to be considered normal in prosperous households by the later medieval period. Others maintain they remained a relative luxury, with most chambers continuing to rely on shutters and cloth. The debate turns on evidence that is fragmentary almost by definition. What is not debated is the ingenuity of the attempts. Clay and moss were pressed into gaps around window frames as seasonal caulking. Rags were stuffed into cracks too small to address otherwise. In some households, heavy curtains were hung directly over the window opening, an additional layer between the glass or cloth and the room, creating a dead air space that reduced the draft further. The measures accumulated, each one partial, together achieving something that individually none of them quite managed. Travelers and guests consistently noted that the higher the chamber, the worse the problem. Tower rooms had the views and the prestige and the wind, all three arriving together and not easily separated. A lord accommodated in a ground floor chamber with thick walls on three sides was in a fundamentally different thermal situation from a guest assigned a tower room where the window faced the prevailing weather and the shutters had an adventurous relationship with their hinges. The sensory reality of a medieval window on a winter night was a composition of sounds as much as temperatures. The shutter testing its bar in the gusts, the cloth billowing inward and falling back, the thin whistle of air finding a gap that no amount of clay had quite sealed, the creak of the frame contracting in the cold. These sounds did not stop when you tried to sleep. They accompanied the night from dusk to dawn, a continuous low-level announcement that the outside world was still there, still cold, and still working on the problem of getting in. Frost formed on the sill, sometimes on the interior surface of the sill, which was the part you were on the same side of as your bed. On the worst nights, the cloth itself stiffened, the oiled surface losing its flexibility as the temperature dropped, going from a yielding membrane to a brittle panel that crackled when the wind pushed it. By morning, in hard winters, ice edged the frame on the inside. You look at the window now. The shutter is closed and barred. Behind it, cloth is tacked across the opening with the optimism of something that is doing its best in difficult circumstances. A thin line of cold air finds the gap between shutter and frame and arrives in the room as a thread of chill against the back of your hand. You tuck your hand under the blanket. The window continues its negotiation with the cold. Neither of them is going to win tonight, and both of them know it. Let us talk about the fireplace. Specifically, let us talk about the gap between what a medieval fireplace looked like and what it actually did, because the two things were related only loosely, and the relationship was not flattering to the fireplace. The hearth in a castle chamber was large. Impressively, almost absurdly large. An opening wide enough in the grandest examples to accommodate a person standing upright, built from dressed stone with carved surrounds that announced the wealth and taste of the household, capable of accepting logs of a scale that would require two people to carry. When it was burning at full capacity, it was spectacular. Flames leapt. Sparks rose. The light it threw across the chamber had the warm, democratic generosity of something genuinely trying its best. The heat went up the chimney. This was not a design flaw in the sense of something that could have been avoided with more careful planning. It was the predictable consequence of a fundamental architectural decision. Wide fireplace openings required wide chimneys to draw the smoke upward and out of the room. Wide chimneys created powerful upward drafts. Powerful upward drafts carried the heat produced by the fire directly out of the building with a thoroughness that would be impressive if it were not so comprehensively counterproductive. The fire burned. The warmth rose. The room remained cold. The relationship between the spectacle below and the comfort of the occupants was, at best, approximate. The practical result was the same arrangement that the Great Hall had already demonstrated. A small island of warmth in an immediate radius around the hearth, surrounded on all sides by the castle's default temperature, which was unhelpful. Sit directly in front of the flames and your face would flush, your hands would warm, your shins would ache pleasantly with heat. Move 6 feet in any direction and your breath would mist. The fire created a zone. The zone was not large. The bed was outside it. Fuel consumption was, by any measure, extraordinary. A large castle in winter burned through timber at a rate that several period sources describe with the exasperation of people watching a resource disappear faster than it could be replaced. A French nobleman complained in his correspondence that maintaining his great hall fire through a single winter had emptied the surrounding woodland at a pace that made warfare seem like a conservative use of natural resources. The irony was complete. Enormous quantities of fuel producing inadequate heat, consumed at a rate that made the arrangement unsustainable. Continued because the alternative was the castle without any fire at all, which was worse. Various attempts were made to improve the situation. Iron firebacks, flat plates placed against the rear wall of the hearth, reflected some of the heat forward into the room rather than allowing it to be absorbed by the stone. Hearth surrounds were occasionally lined with tiles that stored warmth more efficiently than bare rock and released it more slowly after the fire died down. These were genuine improvements in the sense that they made a bad situation marginally less bad. They did not alter the fundamental physics of a wide chimney in a large, cold room. Guests and visitors noticed. Accounts from people staying in castles for the first time carry a recurring note of surprised disappointment. The fire was impressive. The room remained cold. The relationship between the two things was inexplicable to anyone who had expected one to follow from the other. The joke that circulated in various forms held that a noble fireplace was large enough to roast an ox, but insufficient to warm a man. The exaggeration was mild. The observation was accurate. Smaller castle chambers with more modest fireplaces sometimes performed better. For the same reason, the peasant cottage outperformed the great hall. The ratio of fire to space mattered more than the absolute size of either. A fireplace that would be considered entirely inadequate in a large chamber could, in a small solar with low ceilings and good hangings, make a meaningful contribution to the night's temperature. This was not grand or impressive. It worked, which was the more important quality. The peasant hearth, a simple open fire in the center of a one-room cottage, or a basic stone structure against one wall, heated its space with a directness that the castle fireplace, for all its carved stone and architectural ambition, could not match. The cottage had the advantage of being scaled to its fire rather than the reverse. Nobody had built the cottage to make a statement. They had built it to live in, which produced different priorities and, on cold nights, better results. And yet, and this matters, the fire was never only about heat. A roaring hearth in a stone chamber did something that no number of blankets or curtains could replicate. It was present. It was alive. In the long hours of a winter night, in a room that would otherwise have been dark and silent and oppressively cold, the fire pushed back. Not very far, and not very effectively, but visibly, audibly, with an animation that made the room feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. The shadows it threw across the walls moved. The sound it made, the crack of splitting wood, the hiss of resin, the low, steady exhale of sustained combustion, was company of a kind. People sat by fires not only for the heat, but for the light and the noise and the evidence that something in the room was warm and alive. Psychological warmth is not nothing. In a castle in January, it may have been the difference between a bearable night and a genuinely terrible one. Iron firebacks and tiled surrounds addressed the physics. The ritual of sitting by the fire addressed something else. The human need, on a cold, dark night in a stone building, to look at something and believe that the cold had not entirely won. The fire in your chamber has settled now to a steady, moderate burn. A log shifts, sending a brief shower of sparks up the flue. The warmth reaches you where you sit at the edge of the bed, your hands comfortable, your back less so, the familiar gradient of near and far doing what it always does. You absorb what the fire is offering. In a few minutes, you will retreat into the curtained bed and the fire will become irrelevant to your immediate temperature, reduced to a glow visible through the fabric gap and a sound muffled by the curtains. But while you are still here, you sit in its light and accept its limited gift. It is, under the circumstances, enough. The fire is generous with its light. It is generous with its warmth, within the radius already discussed. It is extraordinarily generous with its smoke, which it distributes throughout the chamber with an even-handedness that the heat never quite manages. This is the part of medieval heating that the romantic imagination tends to leave out. The tapestries are vivid in the telling. The carved four-poster is impressive. The smoke is less picturesque, and yet it was arguably the most consistent presence in any medieval room where a fire burned. More reliable than the warmth, more pervasive than the drafts, and considerably more permanent than either. It settled into everything it touched with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. The chimneys were the structural cause. Wide shafts without the controlled draft mechanisms that later centuries would develop, they drew well enough when conditions cooperated. When the wind came from the right direction, and the pressure differential between inside and outside aligned in the fire's favor. When conditions did not cooperate, which was with some frequency in buildings placed on exposed hilltops specifically for their exposure to the wind, the smoke did not go up. It came back. It drifted into the room in lazy, indiscriminate clouds and distributed itself among the furnishings with the thoroughness of something performing a task it had been assigned. The walls darkened. Not gradually, over years, but noticeably over weeks. The stone absorbed the soot and held it, turning chambers that had perhaps been lime-washed to a pale brightness at the start of winter to a smoky gray-brown by February. Tapestries that had been hung partly for their color became, over the course of a single heating season, significantly less colorful. Linen that had been laundered with effort and some pride emerged from a week near the fire with a gray tinge that no amount of subsequent washing entirely removed. A monk in northern England, writing with the resigned candor of someone who had accepted his circumstances without making peace with them, noted that his cell had grown so thoroughly coated with soot that he found himself coughing more than he prayed. The observation was intended as complaint. It reads also as documentary record. This was a man of modest means in a modest space with a modest fire, and still the smoke found him comprehensively. Noble households were not exempt. Court records contain complaints from women about gowns ruined by smoke exposure and linens permanently discolored despite their best efforts at maintenance. A tapestry might be commissioned at considerable expense, hung with care, and rendered dingy within a season by the simple arithmetic of being in a room where a fire burned. The household response was to lime-wash the walls periodically. A thin coat of white plaster applied over the soot to restore some appearance of cleanliness, lasting until the next accumulation required the process to be repeated. The smell, which the lime did not address, remained as a permanent undercurrent beneath every other odor in the room. Peasant cottages managed the problem differently and, in one specific sense, worse. Many had no chimney at all, just an open hearth in the center of a single room, and whatever gap existed in the thatch above to let the smoke find its way out. In practice, the smoke filled the upper half of the interior before escaping, which meant the air near the ceiling was largely smoke, and the air near the floor was the air you breathed. People learned to move through their homes at a crouch without thinking about it. Children grew up breathing the air of a perpetual indoor fire. The rafters above them were black with accumulated soot from years of this, and contemporaries noted, with the tone of people reporting an agricultural benefit they had discovered by accident, that the smoke appeared to deter insects in the thatch and help preserve the timber. This was true as far as it went. It was also the kind of observation that belongs in the category of finding something useful in a situation you cannot change. The smoke was going to be there regardless. You might as well attribute it a purpose. Medical writers of the period were divided on the question of whether smoke was simply unpleasant or actively dangerous. Some took the position that the body adapted, that people who lived their whole lives breathing smoky air developed a tolerance that protected them from the worst effects. Others pointed to the persistent coughs, the blackened lungs described in surgical accounts, the respiratory illnesses that followed people through winter after winter, and concluded that adaptation was not the same as immunity. Both positions were probably correct in different proportions for different people, which is to say that the situation was complicated and the available options were limited. What nobody seriously argued was that the smoke should lead to abandoning the fire. The fire was non-negotiable. Without it, the cold killed you. With it, the smoke made your existence unpleasant in various ways that did not, on balance, kill you. The arithmetic pointed in one direction, and medieval people followed it with the matter-of-fact acceptance of those for whom the perfect was never available and the adequate was a victory. Every morning brought the evidence of the bargain. You woke with smoke in your hair, in the fibers of your blankets, on the inner surface of your lungs in a way that made itself known with the first breath of the day. You tasted it. The chamber around you wore it visibly. The walls, the curtains, the rushes, the clothes hanging on the peg by the door. All of it carried the night's fire as a record that nothing quite erased. You accepted this. Everyone accepted this. To complain about the smoke was to complain about the fire, and to complain about the fire was to announce that you had not fully thought through the alternative. The curtains of your bed carry it now. That familiar layered smell of old fires and cold stone, and the accumulated winters of a building that has been heated this way for longer than anyone currently alive can remember. You breathe it in, adjust to it, and let it become simply part of the background of the night. The smoke has been here longer than you have. It will be here after you have gone. For now, you share the room with it, as everyone does, and find that it is not the worst company the night has to offer. The fire has settled to embers now. The bulk of its work is done, its warmth retreating to that faithful small radius around the hearth, leaving the rest of the chamber to its own devices. What remains in your immediate vicinity, the only source of light and the only source of heat within arm's reach, is a candle. A single flame, perhaps two. Enough to read by if you had something to read, and enough willpower to hold the page steady in the draft. Enough to find the chamber pot in the dark without incident, which was arguably the more pressing practical concern. And enough in the specific arithmetic of a freezing stone room to make a small but not entirely negligible contribution to the temperature of the air immediately surrounding it. This last quality was not accidental. People understood that candles produced heat as well as light, and in a world where every degree was worth accounting for, the heat of a candle flame, modest, local, insufficient to warm a room but sufficient to warm the air around a face, was taken seriously as a resource. Noble households arranged candles in clusters on stands beside the bed, several flames together producing a pocket of warmth that a single candle could not achieve alone. The arrangement served light and heat simultaneously, which in a medieval chamber amounted to addressing two problems with one solution, a combination that was always welcome. The candles themselves came in two distinct categories that reflected, with the directness of most medieval material distinctions, exactly where their users stood in the order of things. Beeswax candles burned clean. Their flame was steady, bright, and relatively smoke-free, and they produced a faint honeyed smell that was genuinely pleasant, one of the few ambient scents in a medieval chamber that arrived without a drawback attached. They were expensive. The expense was sufficient to restrict them, in most households, to the chapel, the Lord's private chamber, and ceremonial occasions where the quality of the light reflected on the quality of the host. To burn beeswax in an ordinary room was a statement of means. Tallow candles were what everyone else used. Rendered from animal fat, beef or mutton suet usually, they were cheap, widely available, and unpleasant in several small ways that accumulated over the course of an evening. They smoked. They sputtered when the wick needed trimming, which it needed more often than anyone wanted to deal with. They smelled of the animal they had come from, a low-level greasiness that mingled with the room's existing olfactory landscape without improving it. In cold conditions, they burned unevenly, the fat congealing at the base and starving the flame irregularly. They were, in short, entirely adequate and consistently annoying, which describes a significant proportion of medieval practical solutions. Rush lights occupied the bottom of the hierarchy. Dried rushes stripped of their outer skin and dipped in fat produced a thin, fragile, quickly burning light that was less a candle than a suggestion of one. Travelers used them. Poor families used them. They burned for perhaps 20 minutes, produced a fitful light adequate for moving around a room without walking into the furniture, and required a supply of replacements if you intended to be awake after dark for any length of time. They were the candlelight equivalent of the straw tick. Not what anyone chose when they had options, but functional within the limits that necessity imposed. The hazard common to all of them was fire. Not the fire in the hearth, which at least had the courtesy to stay where it was put, but the fire that a knocked candle or a curtain placed too close to a flame could produce with a speed that left very little time for considered response. Medieval bedding was, as has been established, a significant accumulation of wool, linen, fur, and in some cases waxed cloth. All of it combustible, most of it arranged in close proximity to whatever light source the sleeper had decided to keep within reach for comfort. The records of accidents are not rare. A German squire, documented in an account whose author seems to have found the incident more illustrative than tragic, fell asleep with a candle positioned on the bed rail. He woke to his blankets burning, escaped with speed and a lasting impression of the event, and was afterward the subject of a cautionary observation that circulated in the household for some time. The lesson drawn was not that candles near beds were inadvisable, the cold made them more or less necessary, but that the arrangement required more vigilance than sleep naturally permitted. Wealthy households addressed this with the pragmatic solution available to people who had servants. Someone was assigned to sit with the candles, not to do anything in particular, just to be present and awake while the rest of the household drifted toward sleep, available to trim a wick, reposition a stand, or deal with the early stages of a disaster before it became a later stage. This role, night candle attendant essentially, appears in household accounts with the matter-of-fact brevity of a job whose existence required no explanation. For everyone without servants available for this purpose, the calculation was made privately and differently. You kept the candle close because the warmth and the light made the night manageable. You trusted that tiredness and luck would arrive in the right proportions. Most nights they did. On the nights they did not, the records occasionally preserve a brief and unhappy account of the consequence. A noblewoman of the period, practical, evidently, and accustomed to cold, insisted on 12 candles in her chamber on winter nights. Her servants found this extravagant. She found it sufficient. The 12 flames together raised the temperature of her immediate surroundings to something she considered acceptable, provided light enough to read before sleep, and gave her the psychological comfort of a room that was visibly multiply illuminated rather than pressing in from the dark on all sides. Whether 12 candles constituted wisdom or excess depends on whether you were the one paying for them or the one sleeping by them. Parents kept small lamps burning near children through the night, for warmth, for safety, for the reassurance that a child waking in a cold, dark room would not wake to complete darkness. Monks allowed lamps in dormitory halls, citing both the practical need for light during the night offices and the less formally stated comfort of a space that was not entirely dark. In both cases, the flame served purposes beyond its simple physical output. It was present. In a cold stone building at the deep hours of the night, presence mattered. Your candle gutters now in a draft from the window. The flame bends, steadies, bends again. The wax has pooled and run down the side in a white rivulet that has hardened on the holder. The light it throws is small and warm and slightly unsteady, and the warmth it offers is real within the few inches that warmth from a candle can honestly claim to reach. You watch it for a moment. The flame leans in the invisible air movement of the room, recovers, stands straight. It is a small thing holding its position against a large cold. You understand the impulse completely. Pull back from the private chamber for a moment. Not everyone in the medieval world had curtained beds and personal candle attendants and the option of moving their bedroom to a sunnier wall in October. For a significant proportion of the people sleeping inside castles and monasteries and great households on any given winter night, the arrangement was considerably less individual and considerably warmer for it. The monastery dormitory was the most formally organized version of this. A long hall, stone-floored, high-windowed, draft-prone in the way that all medieval stone halls were draft-prone, lined on both sides with rows of cots or straw pallets positioned close enough together that the occupant of one could, without any particular effort, hear the breathing of the occupants on either side. Privacy was not a feature of the arrangement. It was not intended to be. The monastic rules that prescribed communal sleeping cited discipline, oversight, and the prevention of what the rules tended to describe as private irregularities. But the thermal consequence was a room full of sleeping bodies generating collective warmth in a space that would otherwise have constituted one of the less appealing places in the building to spend a night. A chronicler observing this arrangement from outside, it noted that the cloister was warmer than the Lord's tower, for the monks lay together like sheaves. The agricultural image was apt. Individual stalks of grain offer little resistance. Bound together, they hold each other upright and create, between them, pockets of air and warmth that none could maintain alone. The monks did the same thing with their bodies, and the result was measurably better than what the Lord achieved in his grand, isolated chamber with his single fireplace and his architectural ambitions. Candles burned in the dormitory hall through the night, not many and not bright, but enough to provide the low, continuous glow that served both the practical requirement of light for the night offices and the less formally acknowledged need for a space that was not completely dark. Whether the warmth they added was physically significant or primarily psychological is a question that probably has the same answer here as everywhere else. Both in proportions that varied by night and by how cold the stone had gotten since November. Military barracks produced the same thermal logic with less spiritual framing. Soldiers billeted in castle garrison quarters slept in long rows on straw beds, their cloaks serving as additional blankets, their weapons stacked in arrangements that reflected the habit of people who liked to know exactly where things were before they closed their eyes. The smell was robust. The warmth was genuine. The exhaustion of people who had spent the day doing physically demanding things in cold weather was such that the quality of the sleeping surface was a secondary concern at best. They slept because they needed to, in proximity to each other because the proximity was warmer than the alternative, and woke because the cold eventually made lying still less appealing than getting up. Apprentices and junior servants occupied the lower end of the household hierarchy and, rather counterintuitively, some of the warmer sleeping spots in the building. Not warmer because anyone had assigned them comfortable chambers. They were typically given whatever space remained after everyone else had been accommodated. But warmer because the spaces that remained were small. Under staircases, in alcoves off the kitchen corridor, in loft spaces above rooms where fires burned through the day, the accumulated warmth of the kitchen, the one place in any medieval building where heat was produced deliberately and in quantity for purposes other than human comfort, drifted upward into the spaces above it and created, entirely by accident, some of the most genuinely warm sleeping spots in the castle. A boy apprenticed to the household who slept on a pallet above the kitchen was, in thermal terms, better situated than the guest of honor in the tower chamber. He would not have said so because the tower chamber came with a feather bed and a status that made the comparison inadvisable. But his toes were warmer in the morning, and on a February night that distinction was not nothing. The historians who have looked carefully at communal sleeping arrangements in medieval institutions tend to come away with a revised sense of who the cold was hardest on. The assumption that wealth and status bought comfort and that hardship descended through the social order holds in most categories. Bedding, food, fuel, clothing, the better off were genuinely better equipped. But the specific hardship of sleeping alone in a large stone room was one that wealth actively created. You had to be important enough to merit a private chamber before the private chamber became your problem. Below a certain level of status, you slept with other people and other people were warm. The debate about whether communal sleeping was genuinely chosen or simply accepted, whether monks and soldiers and apprentices would have preferred private spaces if they had been available, is probably the wrong question. What the evidence suggests is that people adapted to what they had, and what they had in communal arrangements was warmth of a kind that the private chambers above them often failed to provide. Whether this was a consolation or a genuine advantage depended on the night and the company and the question of whether the person in the next cot snored. Most of them snored. This was apparently accepted as part of the arrangement. You imagine the dormitory now. The rows of sleeping figures, the low candlelight catching the edge of a blanket here and the curve of a shoulder there. The sound is considerable. The breathing of many people in various stages of sleep, the occasional cough, the creak of a cot under someone's shifting position. Somewhere near the far end, a man is snoring with the committed enthusiasm of someone who has made his peace with the world. The air smells of wool and sweat and smoke and the particular communal warmth of bodies that have been generating heat together for several hours. It is not a refined smell. It is, however, the smell of a room that is several degrees warmer than the empty corridors outside it. And on that basis, it is welcome. You are not alone in here. Nobody is. That is precisely the point. Before you settle into the dormitory row or draw the curtains of your private bed, there is one more preparation to make. And unlike the modern interpretation of preparing for sleep, which generally involves removing clothing until you reach whatever minimum the temperature and your preferences suggest, the medieval version ran in the opposite direction. You put more on. The nightshirt was the foundation of this process. A long, loose garment of linen, falling to somewhere around the knee or below, it resembled an oversized tunic and served the same basic function as modern sleepwear in the sense that it was the layer worn against the skin during sleep. The comparison stops there. Modern sleepwear exists primarily for comfort and modest convention. The medieval nightshirt existed because the alternative was going to bed in your outer clothes, which people also sometimes did, or in nothing at all, which the available evidence suggests was not widely practiced in winter by anyone with access to a linen shift and the ambient temperature of a stone castle to motivate them. Linen was chosen for practical reasons that had nothing to do with luxury. It laundered more easily than wool, an important consideration in a world where bedding absorbed everything the room produced and needed to be cleaned with some regularity. Against skin, it was smooth rather than abrasive, which wool, in its medieval form, was not. It breathed. It did not trap moisture in quite the way that heavier fabrics did. None of these qualities made it warm, which was why it was never the last layer. Over the nightshirt went whatever wool the temperature and the available supply suggested. An extra tunic, a cloak in serious cold. Whatever had been removed from the outer wardrobe and determined to still have a useful role to play in the sleeping arrangements. The logic was simple and the same logic that applied to the bed itself. Layers, accumulated, each one adding a fraction of resistance to the cold that wanted in. The nightshirt was the start of the argument. The wool on top of it was the continuation. The fur coverlet over everything was, in better appointed chambers, the conclusion. The nightcap, a coif, fitted to the skull and tied under the chin, sometimes with ribbons, sometimes with simple cord, completed the arrangement. This is the detail that strikes the modern imagination as slightly comic. The medieval sleeper in their illuminated manuscript portrait, tucked up in bed. Everything about the scene suggesting repose except the head, which is wrapped with the purposeful snugness of someone prepared for the cold to make a particular attempt on that specific location. The comedy is understandable. The logic behind it was not wrong. The head loses heat disproportionately to its size, and in a room where the air above the bedclothes was cold enough to show breath, leaving the skull uninsulated was a genuine inefficiency. The coif addressed this. It muffled the ears, which in a stone room at 3 a.m, when the wind was testing the shutters and the fire had gone quiet and the sounds of the castle's structural settling were as loud as anything, was an additional benefit that the warmth alone did not account for. Wealthier households extended the principle to the extremities. A 15th century medical text recommended binding the feet in linen or wool before sleep, the writer's position being that the cold entered the body most readily through the feet, and that blocking this access route was basic preventive medicine. Whether the theory was physiologically sound matters less than the fact that the practice made practical sense. Feet, extending beyond the main warmth of the body into the colder reaches of the bed, were the first to register the night's temperature and the last to warm up again. Wrapping them before sleep simply moved that problem earlier in the process and reduced its severity. Strips of wool tied around ankles and insteps became makeshift socks. Linen wrapped around the hands produced something approaching mittens for the hours before sleep arrived, and the hands could be tucked under the blankets. The social dimension of all this was real and not secondary. In a world where sharing a bed was routine and a chamber's sleeping arrangements could include servants, companions, family members, and the occasional visiting dignitary, going to bed in nothing was not a viable option regardless of the temperature. The nightshirt and coif maintained a level of propriety that the practical intimacy of communal sleeping required. Illuminated manuscripts depicting bed scenes, domestic, sometimes tender, occasionally moralistic, show their subjects in caps and long shifts with a consistency that reflects convention as much as cold. You wore your night clothes because the room was freezing and because you were not alone, and both reasons were sufficient. What this produced, in the end, was a figure that looked considerably more prepared for a journey than for sleep. The layered linen and wool, the bound feet, the wrapped head, a medieval sleeper fully armored against the night could have left the building without changing their clothes and been considered adequately dressed for early morning travel in cold weather. The line between sleeping attire and travel attire was, in functional terms, not a wide one. The ritual of dressing for bed was accordingly the opposite of relaxation in the modern sense. It was preparation. The deliberate addition of each layer was a small act of fortification against what the night intended to do, and the night intended to be cold, and the preparation was necessary. You did not wind down into sleep. You armored up for it, adjusted the fastenings, checked that the cap was secure and the feet were wrapped and the wool was where the wool needed to be, and then you lay down in your constructed defense and waited for exhaustion to do the rest. You pull the coif snug now, feeling the fabric press gently around your ears, muffling the sound of the castle settling in the cold. The nightshirt is smooth against your skin. Over it, the wool has found its position. Your feet are wrapped and pressed against each other for additional warmth at the far end of the bed. You are dressed for sleep the way a reasonable person dresses for weather. Thoroughly. With no illusions about what the night is planning. The curtains are drawn. The layers are in place. The armoring is complete. All that remains is to wait for sleep to arrive and trust that you have made the night difficult enough to justify its coming. Before you lie down, before the curtains are drawn and the layers arranged and the coif tied under your chin, there is one more ritual. A servant enters the chamber carrying a long-handled pan. Brass, usually, the surface worn to a dull shine from regular use. Inside it, hot coals from the hearth crackle and shift, their heat radiating through the perforated lid in small, concentrated waves. The servant moves to the bed and begins the process, drawing the pan steadily back and forth between the sheets in long, careful passes, the coals inside doing what coals do when given an enclosed space and a purpose. You watch. The sheets above the pan lift slightly with the warm air rising through them. A faint smell of heated metal and ash fills the chamber, mixing with the existing composition of smoke and wool. Steam rises briefly where the pan passes over a patch of fabric that has absorbed the room's damp. When the pan is withdrawn and the servant steps back, there is a moment, brief, specific, almost surprising, where the bed is warm. Not the room. The room is exactly as cold as it was. But the bed, the interior of the curtained space you are about to occupy, has been converted, for a period that will not last as long as you would like, from a cold slab of linen and fur into something that a person might actually want to enter voluntarily. This was the warming pan's entire purpose, and it was modest enough to be achievable. Nobody expected it to heat the room. Nobody expected the warmth to last the night. The goal was narrower and more honest than either of those things. Make the first minutes of sleep bearable. Get the body into the bed without the shock of cold sheets triggering the kind of involuntary full-body protest that makes falling asleep take an hour. The warming pan was buying time, a short window of artificially produced comfort during which exhaustion had a reasonable chance of outrunning the cold. Noble household inventories listed warming pans alongside candlesticks, chamber pots, and other objects whose presence required no explanation because their use was self-evident and their necessity unquestioned. In households that kept careful records of their domestic equipment, and wealthy medieval households kept very careful records of everything, the warming pan appeared as a standard item, not a luxury, not a novelty, but a tool of winter routine as expected as the fire itself. In Italy, where the practice was documented with particular attention to its elaborations, some households instructed servants to scatter aromatic herbs directly onto the coals before warming the bed. Lavender, rosemary, dried flowers, whose names appear in the accounts with the specificity of people who considered this detail worth recording. The smoke produced by the herbs drifting through the bedclothes was held to purify the air and ward off the night illnesses that were believed to travel invisibly through cold, damp spaces. Whether it did either of these things in any medically meaningful sense is beside the point. The sheets smelled of rosemary for an hour after the pan was withdrawn, And a bed that smells of rosemary is in a different category of psychological experience from a bed that smells only of old wool and the accumulated winters of a stone building. The hazards of the warming pan were real and documented with the frequency of things that happened regularly enough to be worth warning against. Servants who moved too quickly, or who became distracted, or who misjudged the heat of a particular batch of coals, left evidence of their distraction in the form of scorched linen, black-edged patches in sheets that were then either mended, replaced, or recorded in accounts with the tone of mild exasperation. The more dramatic failures involved flames, and the accounts of these carry a different tone. The particular urgency of a fire in a room full of curtains and blankets and rushes in a building made of wood and stone with limited access to water. A bed set alight by a warming pan was not an exotic medieval catastrophe. It was a known risk, managed by attention and experience and the general principle that someone should be watching what they were doing. The fact that it still happened regularly suggests that attention and experience were distributed unevenly across the population of servants assigned to this task, which is consistent with what we know about the distribution of attention and experience in every population at every point in history. The debate among historians about how far down the social scale warming pans penetrated is partly a question of materials and partly a question of definition. The brass pan with its long handle and perforated lid was a manufactured object that cost money and implied a household with the resources to own and maintain it. Simpler versions: clay pots filled with hot coals, stones heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth, ceramic containers of various descriptions, served the same function with less precision and more risk of either insufficient warmth or accidental scorching, depending on the material. Whether you count these as warming pans or as separate category of improvised bed heating is a classification question that the historical record does not answer cleanly. What the record does answer is that the principle, preheat the bed before you get into it by whatever means are available, was practiced across a wide range of households, in various forms and with various degrees of sophistication. The wealthy had brass pans and servants trained to use them correctly. Others had hot stones and the judgment to wrap them tightly enough. The goal was the same in every case. The cold sheets were the enemy. The few minutes of retained warmth were the victory. The strategy was to manufacture those minutes by external means before the body was required to produce them from its own resources. The servant withdraws now. The pan is gone. The warmth it left behind is already beginning its departure. The sheets cooling at the edges first, the warm center contracting toward the middle of the bed with the slow reluctance of something outnumbered. You move quickly. This is not the moment for deliberation. You pull back the covers and slide in, drawing the curtains closed behind you in one practiced motion. The warmth receives you, imperfect, temporary, already fading at the margins but real in the center, where your body can take over the work the pan has started. Your shoulders drop. The cold that has been your companion since you came upstairs retreats to the outside of the curtains, where it will wait with the patience of something that has no other appointments. The warming pan has done what it promised. Nothing more, nothing less. For now, that is enough. On certain nights, not every night, not even most nights, but the nights when circumstances aligned and resources permitted, there was something better than the warming pan waiting at the end of the day. Something that addressed the cold not from the outside in by heating the space around you, but from the inside out, by convincing your body that warmth was its natural condition and the stone room a temporary misunderstanding. The hot bath was the most extravagant version of this. Not extravagant as a relative term. Extravagant in the absolute sense of an undertaking that required significant quantities of firewood, substantial human labor, a large wooden tub lined with cloth to prevent splinters, and enough hot water to fill it to a level worth getting into. These requirements place the hot bath firmly in the category of occasional events rather than daily habits, and the people who recorded them in letters and accounts did so with a specificity that suggested they were describing something worth remembering. Wealthy households in Paris and elsewhere developed the practice of positioning the tub near the chamber fireplace, close enough that the fire heated the room while you bathed, so that emerging from the water meant stepping into air that was, by the standards of the building, warm rather than merely less cold than the corridor. Attendants stood ready with warm towels, Herbs, rosemary, thyme, whatever the season offered, floated in the water for fragrance and the supposed medicinal benefit of their vapors, the steam carrying the scent of summer into a room that had been smelling of winter for months. To lower yourself into hot water in a stone chamber in January was an experience that contemporaries described with a warmth of language suggesting they were reaching for adequate words. The heat was total. It reached places that no blanket had touched since October.